Welcome, everyone, to the Housing Opportunities Made Equal of Virginia's Fair Housing Focus. My name is Monica Jefferson, and I'm pleased to serve as the interim president and CEO of Home. Thank you so much for being a part of this event today. Home was incorporated in September of 1971 by a group of citizens who wanted to make America's promise of equal treatment a reality and ensure that everyone had the opportunity to live in the neighborhood of its choice. Home was founded and birthed out of the need to fight discrimination in housing access. Our mission is to ensure that everyone has equal access to housing. And Home and Access mission, through fair housing enforcement, extensive research, housing counseling and education, housing advocacy and policy issues, and we believe that everyone has the right to choose where to live free from discrimination. When unequal access to housing and credit contributes to most of our growing wealth gap, our multifaceted approach is a powerful catalyst towards furthering fair housing. For 50 years, we've used our voice to educate, develop laws through legislation, and even use the court system to protect against unfair housing practices. As we look forward to the next 50 years, we will continue to address housing-related systemic inequities that perpetuate segregation, concentrations of poverty, and wealth inequality. I'm excited to announce that we've just completed our strategic plan, and I want to share with you briefly some of those strategic efforts in the battle for equal access to housing. First, we believe in an accountability to fair housing. The Fair Housing Act promises an equitable society free of discrimination in housing, but we all know that that promise remains unfulfilled. Home is placing an emphasis on cases with a strategic impact on housing policy and laws on a state and federal level. Segregated housing patterns. Segregation restrains our community from realizing our fullest potential. Home believes that the societal shift towards more integrated housing patterns delivers better life outcomes for communities of color and a more prosperous community for all. Racial inequality in homeownership rates. Home knows, and we all know, that the gap between Black and white homeownership rates is now larger than it was when the Fair Housing Act was enacted. We believe that this is the foundation of wealth inequality in America and needs to be remedied to provide greater wealth and prosperity for families. Over the last 19 months, it has been an unprecedented time. We've been experiencing a major health crisis, a racial reckoning that has impacted our country. And now we're seeing the deployment of pandemic relief bills and funding that has been instrumental in keeping the economy poised for growth in response to the health pandemic. Home wants to be able to continue to provide short-term direct client services for individuals and families who have been impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. And we want to look for the ripples of disruption in housing that may continue to occur in the future. Home has achieved significant goals over the last 5 decades that provide for tremendous social and economic benefits to our Commonwealth, and we are looking forward to the next 50 years. And I hope that you all will be with us on our next journey. Today, we are kicking off our 50th anniversary with this fair housing focus. We hope that you all will join us for some of our other upcoming events that we have planned over the next months to come. I'd like to share with you a few of them. First, we're going to be celebrating 50 years of fair housing with an exhibit at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. This opens November the 8th. As you all know, we had to postpone our Beyond the Dream, our annual Fair Housing Summit, until April 20th of next year So we hope that each of you all will join us for this 2-day event. We have a lot of exciting things planned and scheduled, and we would love to see each of you. Also, we're having an annual 50th gala. More details to come. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the individuals that have helped us with this event. First, we're so thankful and grateful for our 50th anniversary sponsors. This event would not be made possible without their generous contributions. First, I would like to acknowledge our platinum sponsors, Wells Fargo, the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development, and Virginia Housing. Our bond sponsors include JP Morgan Chase, Dominion Energy, Fulton Bank, and Truist. It's not too late to join the fight with us as we celebrate our anniversary. And if you would like to be a part of that, if you would like to be a sponsor, please feel free to contact us for more information. We appreciate your support and attendance at this event as we continue to improve equal access for all Virginians. I am very excited about our event today. Today, we're going to look and learn about housing policy and trends that affect equal housing opportunities. I am pleased to introduce and to welcome our first speaker. And that session will be led by none other than Christine Marra. She's a staff attorney and director of housing advocacy at the Virginia Poverty Law Center. She has been involved with so many years with Home of Virginia, including service over the last 9 years on our board of directors. Christie has spent her entire legal career in determining pursuit of equal access to civil justice for Virginia's low to moderate income and many communities of color. Today, Christie will break down the many historical factors that contribute to widening the gap between white and Black homeowners, such as redlining, urban renewal, the foreclosure crisis, and the mortgage denial disparities. So again, I hope everyone is excited as I am. Sit back, relax, keep your eyes on your screen, and join me in welcoming Christie Marra as she kicks off our Fair Housing Focus. Thank you very much and have a great session today.
Thank you, Monica, and welcome everyone. I was so excited to see the number of people who are listening in today. And I am really going to encourage you all to do more than just sit back and listen. That sounded lovely, but I'm going to retract that suggestion and ask you to stay on the edge of your seat and pepper me with questions, if you will. You know, we've got 45 minutes to talk about this history, and I'd very much like us to use the end of that time to talk about how we can really move Virginia communities in a different direction, open communities up in a deep and real way to give everyone equal access to the neighborhood and home of their choice. There is a lot of damage that needs to be remedied, and we're going to talk about that damage and what did the damage over the next few minutes using an example. And then I'd like to talk about and hear from you on potential ways to change this moving forward. In addition to, and of course, Monica has outlined for you all of the great ways that Housing Opportunities Made Equal uses the tools that we have today to combat discrimination in housing and to really fight for that equal access that we all want to see. I am under the impression that someone who is more technologically savvy than I am is going to put my PowerPoint up on the screen. Thank you, whoever did that. Thank you, thank you. I am, for those of you who don't know me, the Director of Housing Advocacy at the Virginia Poverty Law Center. The Virginia Poverty Law Center is a statewide legal aid organization here in Virginia. We work with all of the civil legal aid offices throughout the state, providing the attorneys and staff with training, providing them with co-counsel on big impact cases, and providing them with technical support on all of their cases. We also do a lot of community education. Our housing team is going throughout the state and doing workshops with the local legal aids. The housing team at VPLC is presenting information to community members. The local legal aid folks are doing one-on-one meetings with community members that have concerns about their housing and maybe have legal claims and want to open a case. And I would encourage any of you who might be interested in attending a session like that to get in touch with me at Christie@vplc.org, or with Laura in my program, Laura@vplc.org, and we will let you know all about what's coming to your community. And if there's nothing coming, we will be happy to work with you to set something up. Poverty Law Center, of course, does a lot more than just housing, although we are doing more and more in the housing realm, I'm happy to say. We also work on behalf of consumers in different areas dealing with debt collection and anti-predatory lending issues, foreclosure, etc. We have a very robust public benefits program that works on issues related to SNAP and WIC and other public benefits I'm forgetting at the moment. We have, again, a very robust health care law program that was instrumental in getting Medicaid expanded in the state of Virginia. We have an elder law attorney, and we have a large family law unit that includes both child welfare, family law, domestic violence, and has a particular focus on providing assistance to victims of domestic and sexual violence who are immigrants. So feel free to always reach out to us. We, the housing team, runs an eviction legal helpline. And so tenants anywhere in the state who are facing eviction can call our helpline and get advice from a licensed Virginia attorney. I could go on and on and tell you about all the wonderful things that my colleagues at the Poverty Law Center do on a daily basis, but I think you're all here and I'm here to talk about the history of housing inequities and how we got to the disparity in Black-white homeownership, which I think, and I think Monica said this, really accounts for a large share of the wealth gap between Black families and white families in Virginia. So let's dig into this. And again, I encourage you to put your questions in the chat and they will be read and we will talk about them. Okay, so if we could go to my first slide. Next slide, please. So I thought one way to illustrate this is to talk about two fictional families in Virginia in the 1950s, the Glens and the Harbors. Now, Frank and Gloria Glenn have two young children, Allie, who's 10, and Sam, who's 6, and they want to buy a home in a nice, attractive neighborhood with good schools. Frank is a dentist, has his own practice, and Gloria is a public school teacher. Our other family is the Harbors, and much like the Glens, John and Gladys Harbor have two children who are 4 and 3, and they'd like to buy a home, again, in a safe, nice neighborhood with good schools. John is an insurance salesman, and Gladys works part-time at the daycare where Sally and Timmy go. So, okay, Mike is taking care of the questions and answers. So please do put your questions in the chat box and Mike is going to make sure I notice them and we talk about them. But for now, let's go to the next slide and see what's happening with the Harbors and the Glens. So the Glens and the Harbors live in Richmond. They're renting in Richmond. Monica's going to read me the questions. Great. They're renting in the city of Richmond, but they're really interested in moving out to the county where things are quiet. They can get a nice 2 or 3 bedroom rancher, relatively new, in a nice school district. They really like the lakeside community out in the western part of Enrico. So they are super excited that they can buy a home now that they can get the new product that the federal government is backing, which is a 30-year loan to pay for the house with only a small down payment. Now, prior to this, this is something that's being widely used after World War II. It came about as part of the New Deal. After World War II, I believe that's right. But in any event, before the Depression, homeowners had to finance the purchase of their homes through private finance companies. And those private companies required large down payments, usually often as much as 50% of the cost of the home. And at the end of the loan period, there were large balloon payments. So you didn't have the same fixed interest rate and the same payment throughout the life of the loan. You had to figure out how to make that big payment at the end. But as part of the New Deal, there were a number of new federal programs that were set up to help people afford homeownership. The Federal Home Loan Bank, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, FHA and Fannie Mae were all created. And the FHA offered federally backed insurance for home loans by FHA approved lenders. These were the loans that we know today, with long terms, such as 15, 20, 30 years, fixed interest, and small down payments. And we know that today there are products available that require down payments as low as 3%, which is a far cry from the private lending industry that were financing the mortgages prior to the Great Depression and the creation of this program. And so these products, with the very favorable, accessible, affordable terms, were available because the federal government was insuring the loans, right? Okay, I know there was a question. I don't have Monica reading me a question yet. Again, please put those questions in the chat. Monica's eyes are on the chat box looking for questions. All right, Monica, did you have one for me?
No, I don't see any right now, but as soon as I have them, I'll share them with you verbally as well, okay?
Terrific, terrific. For now, let's go on to the next slide and see what the Glens and the Harbors do. So the Harbors, and you'll remember the Harbors, he works as a salesperson and she works part-time in the daycare. They found a house that they loved right away, a wonderful little 3-bedroom brick rancher in the lakeside neighborhood that they love. They purchased it with the help of an FHA-backed 30-year fixed interest mortgage at a sales price of $27,000. Their down payment was $850. They only had $200 saved. Remember, this is back in 1950s. But their parents had some money put away and were able to provide the balance of $650. Now the Glens, at the same time that the Harbors found this wonderful home in Lakeside and signed a contract and got approved for this federally guaranteed loan, the Glens looked in or wanted to look in the Lakeside neighborhood, and they asked their realtor to show them a house there or a few houses. But their realtor advised them to look in other neighborhoods within the city of Richmond instead of looking in Enrico County. And while their realtor didn't disclose this, their realtor knew that the number of houses that they could look at in Enrico County's Lakeside were very, very limited, and maybe even non-existent, because so many of those homes contained restrictive race-based covenants. And these were covenants that said that the home could only be sold to white people. These were unlawful. By the time the Glens were looking to buy a home, the U.S. Supreme Court had already held that these race-based restrictive covenants in real property deeds were unconstitutional. That was the case of, if I'm getting it right, Shelley versus Kramer in 1948. Despite this, those covenants in the deeds, those race-based covenants still existed, were still written into deeds, and were still followed by realtors and others, despite the fact that it was unlawful. And Sarah notes, theoretically, the realtor had a responsibility to let the Glens know this information up front, right? Yes, sure, absolutely. They had that responsibility. But whether or not it happened, I mean, I would argue this was not a very good realtor. But yes, I believe they would have had to do that. I honestly don't know whether there was a specific law that required them to do that, because other than the fact that they would be seen as the Glens fiduciary rather, and as the Glens fiduciary, the Glens agent, they should have disclosed this. But other than that general law, I don't know if there was something more specific to realtors that would have required that in 1950. Great question though. All right. Unless there, yes. Is there anyone else who can't hear me? Well, please let us know. Okay, other people can hear. Okay, hopefully Ms. Griffin can get her sound fixed. Okay, let's go on to the next slide and see what happens to the Glens. Since they weren't able to talk a realtor into showing them a house in Lakeside, the Glens go back to the city and start looking in the city of Richmond's Randolph neighborhood. And Randolph is a lovely neighborhood with nice 2- and 3-bedroom ranchers, very similar to Lakeside. They find a 2-bedroom home with a nice yard with a list price of $22,000. And they enter into a contract with the seller to purchase that house, but they are not able to get a 30-year fixed interest rate mortgage because their application for a mortgage is denied because the Homeowners Loan Corporation will not insure their mortgage. So to qualify for a federally insured mortgage, property had to be deemed a good risk by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation. I think most of you are familiar with this. The Homeowners Loan Corporation would grade the property. The best risk were graded A, and they had a color, it might have been green. Those with the highest risk were graded D and colored red. And the primary reason that homes and neighborhoods were graded D as being a very, very bad risk, very high risk, and not worth being insured by the Homeowners Loan Corporation was because the majority of people living in the neighborhood were non-white, usually Black people, usually African-American people, but also could be, people of other races, but they were non-white. And so your white neighborhoods were graded A, and you could always get a loan guaranteed there. Your predominantly Black neighborhoods were graded D, and no one could get these very good products, these new federally guaranteed mortgages. I see there's something in the chat. Is there a question? No. Okay. Let's go on to the next slide. So even though they weren't able to get a federally guaranteed mortgage, the Glens buy the house in Randolph and finance it privately through something called a contract for deed. Under the contracts for deeds, the home, essentially the seller would finance the purchase and would do so through a contract that required monthly payments, just as a mortgage would. But unlike a mortgage, when you purchased a home through a contract for deed, the deed, the title to the property, stayed with the seller until the last payment was made. So under the contract for deed that the Glens used to buy their house, they actually didn't buy their house. The title to the house remained with the seller, and they would not get that title until they made the final payment. And if almost every contract for deed had a forfeiture provision in it, and the forfeiture provision said that if the purchaser missed a single payment, they would forfeit every payment that was made, every dollar that they paid, they would lose, and they would be evicted from the property. Contracts for deed were one of the most predatory forms of lending and home acquisition that have ever existed, among many, many, many predatory forms. They were primarily offered to Black home purchasers who couldn't get federally backed mortgages. There was a major outcry against contracts for deed in Chicago, where they actually had, I can't remember what it was called, the Anti-Contract for Deed Society. Maybe somebody out there remembers this piece of their history, but there was some real grassroots organizing. I'll be right with you, Sarah. Sarah is making some really good points. Organizing that, folks were extremely vocal in opposition to the contracts for deeds. There was a recent report done by Duke University and University of Illinois, Chicago, that found that up to 95% of the homes that were sold to Blacks in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s were financed through these predatory products. So let me see, I'm sorry. Sarah says, sorry, I'm trying to get to it.
Christie, you want me to read it to you?
That would be lovely, thank you.
Okay, all right, so Sarah points out, she said, not to get hung up on this point, but the realtor could have showed the Glen some homes in Lakeside, right? What would happen if the family tried to enter a contract with a home there and it became apparent that there was an exclusionary race-based clause? Would this have been a situation in which the Glens could have taken this issue forward?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that if the realtor had done the right thing, if the realtor had been a different kind of person in this hypothetical, and had said, you know what, I'm going to show you these things, but you need to know they've got these provisions in it, and there could be a problem, right? They may not be willing to sell to you, or there may be some, I don't know exactly how it would have played out, but they certainly could have challenged those in court. I think there were very practical reasons that didn't happen more often. The first one being what we suppose happened in this hypothetical, which is the realtor didn't even bother showing those. The realtor wants a commission. That's how the realtor makes money, right? But so the realtor wants to show them homes that they can buy and where they can finish the deal and where he or she will get paid. But again, if the realtor, and there were instances, absolutely, where realtors would show occasionally Black families homes in neighborhoods where there were restrictive covenants, and would show homes that were under a restrictive covenant, and that could be absolutely challenged in court. Tony asks, well, let me get to Tony's question first. Tony's question was, well, in 1950s Richmond, how much chance of success would they have had challenging a race-based covenant in a deed? Who knows? But technically, under the Shelley v. Kramer case, in which the Supreme Court held such covenants to be unconstitutional and unenforceable, they should have held such a covenant like that to be unenforceable. I will tell you that the statute regarding race-based restrictions in deeds was not repealed until a couple of years ago, when there was a real effort to remove the now unenforceable but clearly Jim Crow legislation that had been on our books for years, and that was in there. So John Saunders, we could say that the contract for deed could have possibly been orchestrated by the realtors and the contract for deed institution. You know, it's a good question. He's saying, have there been uncoverings of these practices within the past decade that veils another known practice? Not that I know of, but I think there's still a lot that we don't know. I think there are things that we'll never know. But you know, your big question really is, were the systems working together to perpetuate racism and discrimination and segregation? And I think the answer to that is yes, yes. And we'll see more of that as we talk about this some more. And John mentioned steering too, and that is, you know, very much what we're talking about here, where folks were, you know, Black homeowners were steered into predominantly Black neighborhoods. White home buyers were steered into predominantly white neighborhoods, except in the case of something called blockbusting. And blockbusting, and someone is going to step in and do anybody at home who wants to step in and give a better explanation of this than I'm going to stumble through, please feel free. And Monica, obviously that includes you. but blockbusting was the practice of showing a Black family a home in a white neighborhood to encourage the other white homeowners to put their homes up for sale at fairly low prices. And then, the realtors would buy it up and sell it to a Black family at a much, much, much higher price. Deeds sound like rent-to-own contracts as they relate to defaulting on payments. Wait, I'm sorry. Laura's saying Black families selling homes for low prices. Oh, okay. I had it backwards. So what Laura is saying is that I may have the blockbusting backwards. Again, home people, I know that you know this, so feel free to step in.
Hey, Christie, if you want me to add, blockbusting is discriminatory and illegal real estate practice. What it does is it convinces property owners to sell their homes based upon the assumption that a new neighbor will change the social economic makeup of that neighborhood.
Thank you. That was an excellent explanation. Yes, Shivaughn just added another definition: incentivizing white home buyers to sell their homes in fear that Black home buyers were moving in. And it was always my understanding that the realtors made out big because they would people would sell quickly, and they would sell for maybe not the best price they could get, and then the realtors would buy it and turn around and sell it to usually then Black home buyers at an inflated price. And actually, though I know it's not the same, and I'm not saying it's the same, but there is some element of that in flipping houses today, especially when we see and hear of speculators calling or going door to door even in neighborhoods that have experienced disinvestment. And these are largely and often neighborhoods that are predominantly neighborhoods of, where, Black and brown people have lived. And we see these speculators, again, going door to door. We hear about them calling people living in these neighborhoods and asking if they want to sell their homes. I think that's happening all over the city of Richmond in the older neighborhoods now. And what these folks are looking for are folks who don't understand the value of their homes, who are willing to sell cheap, and they're then going to fix it up and make some, 100, 200, 300% profits. So when this presentation is not going to touch gentrification, I think that's a whole presentation in and of itself. But when you hear people, or when we talk about gentrification and it doesn't feel like a warm and fuzzy thing, to me, that is why, though that is the problem inherent in gentrification, is the high likelihood that it has involved or will involve that type of speculation where folks are really trying to make a quick buck by, first and foremost, purchasing homes from people who don't know their value. Okay, I know people are making comments. Monica, do you want to read the comments in the chat before we move on? Would you mind?
Let me cut my mic on first. That might help. Robin Leader White, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She was just mentioning that selling to Black families to scare white families off into moving and selling cheap. Then the speculators would turn around and sell the homes back to Black families at a higher rate, or send in a Black person to walk through the neighborhood with a stroller to cause white flight. And then many of these speculators, of course, have been making money off of racism.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's, I know some people may be offended by this, but I do think that still happens today. And we'll move on to the next slide, and I'll stop saying things that are purely opinion. Oh, Scott says, the big difference is that with blockbusting, they were creating fear that the values would drop because Black moved into the area. This is different than now, when they're simply looking for people that are thinking from the old values. Yes, that's an excellent point. I think the intent, the motivation is a little bit different, right? But I think everyone understands what I'm saying, that there is now a group of speculators that are specifically looking for people who don't appreciate the value of their homes, who don't understand that they could get a lot of money for their homes. And I think that is a problem. It is a different type of problem, though. Okay. All right. Okay, so we're going to get back to the Glens, and then what I'm hoping, and honestly, Monica's got to keep me straight on the straight and narrow during this presentation, because I have no idea how much time we have left.
You're doing good on time, Christie. You're doing.
Thank you. I'm hoping that we can use the last 15 minutes to really continue the conversation that's happening in the chat, and also get some suggestions from everyone. So the Glens, as you will remember, purchased this 2-bedroom in Randolph, couldn't get the 30-year federally guaranteed loan because Randolph was a graded D neighborhood by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They took out a contract for deed, and they managed to make all the payments, or almost all the payments. They've made about 2/3 of the payments when they're approached by neighbors in 1972 about the city's plans to build a new highway through their neighborhood. The city, through Richmond Redevelopment Housing Authority, actually couched this in terms of urban renewal. And they put together a detailed plan in 1972 about how they were going to revitalize the Randolph neighborhood. And this revitalization included tearing down a significant number of homes, putting in 2 different types of public housing, one for seniors and one for families. And as the slide says, putting, I think it's 195 directly through the neighborhood, just putting this big slash down the middle. there was, at the time that the first plan came out in 1972, a public outcry from neighbors. The neighbors very clearly said, and it's in the plan, we don't want this. Don't tell us you're trying to help us. Don't tell us that you're renewing our neighborhood and you're getting rid of its slum clearance. We don't want this. And it was, in fact, Randolph was, in fact, a nice middle-income neighborhood. But it was a nice middle-income neighborhood where most of the residents were Black. And those were the types of neighborhoods that were targeted for highway construction, and they called it urban renewal. So there were objections, and actually RRHA kind of went back to the drawing board a little bit. They started the plan in 1972, they stopped, they started again in 1975. As of today, they still haven't finished implementing the plan, but in the meantime, I have it on here somewhere, over 480 families lost homes that they owned. So there were some homes that were demolished that were rentals, but 485 families lost homes that they owned, some of which they were the second generation of their family to live there. Now, I don't know what to tell you about the $20,000. Robin has just asked, how does the city pay the Glens? Hold on, I'm trying to open this up. How does the city pay the Glens $20,000? I'm sorry. Monica, would you mind reading that? And then I'll tell you what I think.
Robin asks, how does the city pay the Glens $20,000 for their home if they had no actual equity since they had bought the contract? The contract for deed. Robin, I don't know. And that was a pure guess. I have yet to be able, there was nothing in the reports that I found that indicated how much people were paid, but this was done through eminent domain powers. I have to believe that somebody was paid something. I just have not yet been able to uncover how much they were paid. As far as who would have actually been paid, again, I don't know. I don't know if the city would have been savvy enough to look at all the deeds and figure out who had still owed money to the bank and who had title and who didn't. I would have been real surprised if they had gone into that level of detail. But I do believe that there were some payments made to these homeowners. I'm just still in the process of trying to figure out who, if anyone, has researched that. So if anybody here knows, please send me an email, christie@vplc.org. I'm getting ready to dig into that issue very soon. All right, and Monica, there were a couple of other things I'd love to hear. What else is in the chat? Sure. Pamela Johnson asks, is there any organization that looks for individuals who have valuable homes that may sell their homes for less than their value? Or do you have any suggestions on how to find and help these people?
That's a great question. It's a great question. You know, I can tell you that some of the neighborhood associations in these neighborhoods are being very proactive about it. I was looking at the Fulton Neighborhood Center. I know that's not the right name for it, but the Fulton Neighborhood Resource Center, which puts out a newsletter. And I believe it was in their newsletter that they were being, very clear about warning residents of Fulton Hill not to sell anything without talking to their own realtor and getting an independent assessment. And I think there are folks that are really trying to educate people in these communities. As far as, it's a great question, an organization really designed to educate people in the city of Richmond about the value of their homes and about these predatory practices. I don't know of anything like that. And I think that is a niche that I would love to see somebody fill. Anything else?
Christie, we also have one comment to Augustine Rodriguez, who is our past board chair. Home. He stated, with respect to concerns about a seller not recouping full value for their home, this strikes me as a perfect opportunity to hire a qualified realtor. A good realtor will show the client comps
Yep.
and make the case for the sale of the property at a certain price.
Yeah, absolutely, Augustine. I think that's a great point. I think the problem is in the way that these speculators operate. They're cold calling people, right? They're leaving flyers on people's doors. And I think that we all have concerns about folks who bought their homes maybe 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, or inherited their homes. And we're seeing property values, assessments in the city of Richmond go through the roof. That means property taxes are going through the roof for some of these families. They may be pressed. They may have deferred maintenance needs that they can't afford to fix. And somebody calling and offering any amount of money may sound really good. I certainly can understand that. Okay, Monica says we have 15 minutes left, but we still have a couple of things in the chat. Was the Randolph neighborhood where 195 was constructed through Richmond? Yes, that is exactly right. Yep. Okay, next slide, please. I think we're almost at the very end. Okay, so this is more recently. Again, we're talking about our fictional family, the Glens. In 2007, the Glens' oldest child, Allie, is ready to buy a home. She finds a 2-bedroom house in Randolph where she grew up, and she thinks she can afford it. Loan officer she works with gets her qualified for an adjustable rate mortgage with a subprime interest rate, which he assures her is a good deal. Allie uses almost all her savings for the 3% down payment on the home. Unfortunately, Allie can't make the payments once the amount goes up, and she loses her home through foreclosure. This was a really big and really painful part of the Great Recession in the 2000s. Lenders were providing these products known as subprime mortgages and really targeted Black homebuyers. According to a report by the U.S. by HUD, borrowers in upper income Black neighborhoods were twice as likely as homeowners in low income white neighborhoods to refinance with the subprime loan. When we go back to the growing disparity in homeownership and the accompanying growing disparity in wealth between Black families and white families, and there's yet another practice that we can point to, more recent practice saying that it was part of the cause for this, an ongoing cause. Sounds like there is an organization in Charlottesville with a program that assists families in knowing the value of their homes and how to price them. That is awesome. So I'd love to know more about that too. I think we have one more slide and then we can open it up for more discussion. We're going to check back in with the Harbors. In 2007, the same year that Allie Glenn bought her house, which she then lost during the foreclosure crisis, the Harbors decide to finally sell their house in Lakeside, which they have owned for a long time. The house has served them well. In addition to being a great place to raise their children, the house gave them equity to borrow against for money to send both their kids to college. When they put their house on the market in 2007, they had paid off both the initial mortgage and the home equity line of credit. They were able to sell their home in Lakeside in 2007 for $130,000, netting $103,000 in profits. And then I just end by showing you what you all know, except with the exact figures. In 2019, the median wealth of Black households was slightly over $24,000 compared to $189,000, which was the median wealth of white households. And I think the story of the Glens and the Harbors, I hope, has done a pretty good job of illustrating how housing policy and practice over the past 6, 7, 8, 9 decades really significantly contribute to this disparity. So let's open it up. I think we have about 10 minutes left, if I'm not mistaken. I think, is there another slide or does it just say questions? I think it just says, oh, wait, there's one more, sorry. And this is actually the most recent data we have from 2019. I think the Lending Tree report was also 2019, found that Black homebuyers were denied mortgages an average of 12.64% of the time compared to 6.49% for non-Hispanic whites. So as recently as 2019, Black homebuyers were being denied mortgages twice as often as white home buyers. And then we've got more data from the CFPB, same numbers, a little bit worse even. 16% of Black applicants were denied mortgages compared to 7%. And the legacy of redlining is strong. Applicants of all races are more likely to be denied a mortgage when the house being purchased is in a predominantly Black neighborhood. I mean, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I think it's time for us to all take some collective, innovative, and bold steps to change this trajectory. Comments? I know a lot of people have been putting things in the chat, which I love. But what are your thoughts? What do we do? What are the policies that can start to remedy decades and decades and decades of wrongs? And we haven't even touched on all of the things that contributed to the Black-white homeownership gap, but I think we got the major ones. It's hard in this venue, right, to just kind of shout out an idea, but I guess your fingers can do the shouting. I will tell you about an initiative that the Poverty Law Center is working on with a wide group of stakeholders. We're calling it the Reparative Homeownership. Yes, thank you, Mariko. We're calling it the Reparative Homeownership Program, and it is, as Mariko just suggested in the chat, it is, our goal is to establish, at least at a pilot program level in the Richmond area, a robust down payment assistance program for people who were affected by these racist policies, and that includes the descendants of people who were directly affected. And when I say a robust down payment assistance amount, we're talking about anything from $15,000 to $125,000. We have some really good down payment assistance programs in the state of Virginia. Home has a really good down payment assistance program, but I don't think that we're at that amount. And go back a slide or two, please. Next slide, I'm sorry, next slide. So next slide, sorry. Thank you. I really just want us to pause, right? And think about these two fictional families who nonetheless represent tens of thousands of people, of families. One of them, at the end of, 30, 40 years, maybe they got a little bit of money from the city when the city came and took their home for eminent domain. We don't have any, we don't know for sure, like whether people were paid, what they were paid. But certainly wouldn't think it would be more than, $10,000, $20,000. And on the other side, we have a family who didn't face any of those barriers. And at the end of that time period, they've got $100,000. They can put that toward their retirement home. They can do whatever they want with that. What does that say about what we need to do now? I would say it more than justifies a large down payment assistance program.
Christie, you have several comments in the chat.
Yeah, could you read them, please?
Sure. Let me open up the screen here. And so a couple of things that education is the key and ensuring resources are equitable. This is a start, having the conversation that Virginia was built on racism. The 1902 Constitution says it all. Who will fund the race-based down payment assistance? You want to address that?
Let me answer that real quick. There's the program we're proposing is not race-based. The program we're proposing is to remedy or provide reparations for the historical blocking of certain families from long-term home ownership. So if you look at the data, say for Randolph, you will see that while most of the families living in Randolph at the time of the quote urban renewal were Black, not all of them. I mean, there were a small percentage of families who were affected by that urban renewal that were white, and their descendants are every bit as eligible for this robust down payment assistance as anybody else. So it's not race-based. It is based on the impact of racist policies. But it's really important for us to remember that those racist policies did not only affect the people that they were targeted against. There were white families who suffered as a result of these racist policies, because they too lost their home when 195 was put through the predominantly Black middle class neighborhood of Randolph. So I just wanted to point out that while the policies were racist, the solution is not race-based. The solution is tied to historical fact.
Couple other comments, Christie. Definitely, we need more minority appraisers. They played a significant role in the depressing value of homes, and we know the issues that we're seeing for African-American homeowners and how the values of their home are decreased compared to white homes in African-American neighborhoods. Another comment, educating realtors is crucial. Someone said that they've been selling homes for 17 years, and this is the first time that they've seen it laid out like this. And perhaps it needs to be part of a mandatory education. The wealth disparity is simply unacceptable. In addition to that, someone said, ensuring that we have equal access to information and resources makes a world of difference when systemically Black families have been starved of opportunity to become homeowners. Absolutely. Yes. Someone indicated that they are disabled and they've been told that paying a mortgage is cheaper than paying for rent, but they don't qualify to buy a house.
So let me just, absolutely, your mortgage payments tend to be cheaper than rent. There are a number of programs that are really geared toward helping people with lower incomes afford home ownership. Richmond Habitat for Humanity has such a program. Obviously, Home has its down payment and home ownership readiness program. And then the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust is another way that housing in Virginia, in Richmond in particular, is more affordable and made more affordable. So sorry, Monica, I know there were more comments. But
there are a ton of them, and we've got about 3 more minutes. So I want to just kind of peruse through the
sure.
If there are any additional questions. It looks like someone asked, how would a person qualify for those robust funds?
So there are, we're still working on trying to get the funding for the program. So the program is not established yet. We're hoping it will be established within the next year. But it would be, and we're also hoping that there will be, as part of the funding, a specialist who will help people who think they might be eligible research the history of their family homes or the loss of the home. So probably the easiest way to qualify would be if, in fact, you know that your parents or grandparents had one of those homes in one of the communities, Randolph, Navy Hill, Jackson Ward, where, quote, urban renewal deprived people of homes that they owned. So there are records of that. And we're still, we still need to sit down and look at those. But that's going to be the cleanest way to do it. Then there are some other options too, but that's the primary way.
All right, Christie, just a couple of comments and then we'll wrap this opening session up. How would a person qualify? We already talked about that, I'm sorry. The federal housing policy continues to perpetuate racial discrimination. Also, someone put in the chat a very Martin Day block busting, I guess, example of that if you want to click on the link. And then home equity is typically tied to educational gains used from taking a loan against your home. I find this argument limits the fact that loans against your home can also be used to open up your own small business, another avenue for prosperity.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think a great thing for a really great point for us to end on, which is that home equity leads to all sorts of other wealth building, right? As Susie has pointed out, you can use that home equity not only to finance education for your children or yourself, you can use it to start a business. You can use it to buy your own investment property that will make you money. You can use it to invest in something else. And so in our country, for most people, owning a home is the cornerstone of building wealth. And if you don't have that, it is the foundation on which most of us build wealth. And so if you don't have the opportunity to build that foundation, you never get to build the wealth. So thank you for pointing that out. And thank you, Monica, for giving me this great opportunity. I just loved all the questions. I loved that you trusted me enough to talk about what I think is the most important housing issue of our day, and many days to come and many days past. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much, Christie. Can everyone join me in giving a round of applause or put up your hands symbol in the chat? This was an outstanding presentation, Christie. Thank you so much for bringing some of the most important issues to our attention and also reminding us of the work that still needs to be done. And so we really, really appreciate all the insight that you shared with us and help us continue to move forward with this conversation.
Yes.
So this concludes our opening session. Now I'm going to turn it over to, thank you again, Christie. I'm going to turn it over to Shivaughn Ferguson, our Director of Fair Housing.
Thanks, Monica, and thanks, Christie, again for that different take on a very important topic and an interactive session. Next up is Heidi Aggele. She is the Managing Director and co-founder of Root Policy Research. Root Policy Research did a report on our Richmond Regional AI and recently was published. So Heidi is going to go over the findings, and then after that we'll do a panel discussion about the report. Thanks, Heidi.
Yeah, thanks, Shivaughn. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I think I've got, oh, excellent. I've got the ability to do that. And I'm going to put this in PowerPoint and presentation mode. So I'm going to take up a bunch of the screen here as I work through that. I promise everyone that I will pause for questions. I've got a lot of information and data to share. As Shivaughn said, my name is Heidi Aggele. I work with a Denver-based women-owned business called Root Policy. We do fair housing work and housing market studies all throughout the country. We're really, really honored to be able to do this work in Richmond. Today, I'm going to talk a bit about the study and give you an overview of why these studies are so important and kind of the state of the requirement of fair housing studies. I'll focus on community engagement that we did and what we learned from that, plus the quantitative analysis that we did. So big picture research findings. I'm going to end with our recommendations, and then I'll take questions and answers toward the end too. And then I get to pass the baton to a group of panelists who are involved in both the research as well as the formation of the study, so they can talk about their experiences, bringing all of this information together. But first, I want to acknowledge the wonderful organizations that, like Home, that you have in the region, and what a pleasure it was for us to work in the region. We do these types of studies all over the place, and a lot of times we don't see the level of capacity and resources that you all have, and really the generosity that people gave to this study in terms of their time. We worked with a lot of community navigators to get to the folks who are most vulnerable to experiencing barriers to housing choice. And a lot of residents talked to us too and filled out surveys, and this study would not be as rich as it is in terms of data and information and the ability to really do something with this information to address many of the barriers that we all just talked about without the participation of all of these folks. So I just want to extend gratitude to everybody who was a part of this study. I'm going to start talking a little bit about why these studies are required. So the Fair Housing Act, for those of you who don't have this memorized, took place in 1968. It prohibits discrimination initially in the sale or rental of financing of dwellings, and that was based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. So disability and familial status were left out of those original protections. That happened 20 years later. It was amended to prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability. That includes, so the courts have since then concluded that includes people who have substance abuse challenges, are in recovery, as well as familial status. That includes women who are pregnant. The 1988 amendment also required accessible units as part of multifamily units built after 1991. So the Fair Housing Act took that form for a long time. There's a provision in it it's got a lot of attention recently. I think it was a bit of a surprise to see this elevated in the political spectrum last year. There's a piece in the Fair Housing Act that extends beyond the non-discrimination mandate. So as the act reads, it says actors cannot deny housing, but there's this other piece to it that calls on HUD to administer HUD's programs and activities in a way that affirmatively furthers the purposes of the Fair Housing Act. There's a lot of case law that's happened since then that has considered what that affirmatively furthering aspect means. And in general, that means that a city or a county that's a partner in receiving HUD funds and in investing in housing and community development activities has to do more than just say, we're enforcing the Fair Housing Act. In fact, they have to be HUD's partner in reversing the discriminatory acts that you just heard about in the past presentation. So what does that mean from like the city of Richmond's perspective or Chesterfield County's perspective? For many, many years, they were obligated to do something called an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. And those studies were done at the jurisdiction level, but never at the regional level. In last year in 2020, the Trump administration started to take a look at this AFFH, this Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act provision, put out a federal rule that said that the AFH terminology is kind of confusing, and we're not sure how it really relates to the Fair Housing Act. And so we're going to give communities more choice than they ever have in self-defining how they're affirmatively furthering fair housing. That rule was reversed by the Biden administration effective July 31st, 2021. So this summer, or it was actually in June 10th, a rule came out, and I've got a link to that there at the bottom of this slide. If there is any Federal Register that, communication that you read, I would pull up that link and take a look through that. I think it's an excellent compilation of the case law that defines what this affirmatively furthering obligation means. And really, in sum, jurisdictions receiving any kind of HUD funding, including the CARES Act, so the funding that came through last year to assist with pandemic relief, they need to, because they sign a certification that says they'll affirmatively furthering fair housing. Now, as I said, HUD has interpreted that differently over time, but right now what the Biden administration says is you as a jurisdiction need to document this. You need to demonstrate that you are being and acting as HUD's partner in affirmatively furthering fair housing. We're going to give you some choices on how to do that. And one of those choices is creating a fair housing study like the Greater Richmond did. So this quote here is directly out of that rule. Any of you who are planners or housing policy experts within jurisdictions in the state of Virginia, I would invite you to read that rule. I think it's really well done, and it gives you a lot of direction on what's expected. HUD will be releasing more assistance, my understanding is, in the future about how to comply with this rule. So as I said earlier, an AI, an analysis of impediments, is one way to affirmatively further fair housing. And that really is a data-driven, community-driven approach to look at segregation, expanding access to opportunity, how a community or a region can address other fair housing issues. And it's really designed to aid local leaders, so housing planners, community development planners, stakeholders, advocates, organizations like Home, to use that data to remedy the past discrimination that has caused the inequities that we see today. And a really key aspect of that is the meaningful actions piece. So this is a report that's not intended to sit on the shelf. It's not a box checking exercise. There was quite a dramatic shift away from that under the Obama administration. This is a report that you need to do something with. And I'm going to talk about how the region has embraced that in just a moment. So the participants in the regional AI was led by Regional Planning Agency, Plan RVA. Their website link is right there. The participants included Petersburg, Richmond, Hopewell, Colonial Heights, the counties of Chesterfield and Henrico, and then all of the housing authorities that operate within the jurisdiction. It was a great team effort. We had, I think, monthly meetings, maybe bi-monthly meetings, virtual meetings where we talked about the progress of the study, we talked about community engagement, and then toward the end we held a series of workshops where we discussed not only the fair housing challenges, but what the jurisdictions and the region can do about those. So what does this plan look like? I'll give you a link to the plan at the end of the presentation and kind of walk you through it, but just big picture, there's a research element, there's a community engagement element, and then there's this goals and action items element. So the research section look at demographic and segregation, disproportionate housing needs. I'm going to define that as I go through that part of the presentation. Disparities in access to opportunity, I'll talk about that as well. We took a look at zoning and land use barriers. We are a firm that's made up of economists as well as planners, certified planners. I was a former member of the Denver Planning Board and served in that role for about 4.5 years. And we've really seen the evolution of zoning and land use, both in creating housing barriers or perpetuating those barriers, and opening up opportunities. So we always do a zoning and land use analysis as part of our studies. And then we look at fair housing resources and evaluation, which I will say in the Richmond region was easy because you have so many wonderful organizations and so much capacity in that realm. And then putting all of that together, as I mentioned, we held a number of workshops with the regional participants to look at and define goals to address barriers, action steps, so short-term and long-term actions to implement those goals. I'm going to talk a minute about community engagement. This is an infographic that we put together that summarizes the number of residents engaged. We had really good participation in a resident survey that we did. That survey that we've designed and we've used in a lot of municipalities, including Baltimore, the Bay Area, the Denver region, and Harris County in Texas, as well as Memphis and the Richmond region. So we have a lot of comparative data and a lot of experience with this type of resident survey. We ask about the experience of displacement, the experience of discrimination, major barriers to housing choice. And as you can see, we represented both low-income people as well as people throughout every geography within the region, and we had really good racial diversity. And it's very important to us because a survey like this enables us to do what we call cross-tabbing. So we can look at the different experiences of people by their protected class. And that's really, really important in how we define disproportionate housing needs. So when we took a look at the primary findings from the community engagement, this is what we found. So top level findings. Voucher holders told us they had a really hard time finding housing. 8 of 10 voucher holders said finding a landlord that accepts vouchers is difficult or very difficult. Some people said this is nearly impossible. I can't find a unit that accepts vouchers. I exhaust that 60-day time period that I'm allowed. The region was in the early phases of adopting source of income protection, which says if you're a landlord, you can't discriminate based on voucher holder status. It's got a short window, though, in terms of claiming that status and that discrimination. And some of those voucher holders said that window is just too short, it's too hard to be able to find protection through that 15-day window. We also talked to a lot of residents who were currently or who had lived in public housing. Many of them said, this is really a launch pad to permanent housing. We're happy to have the opportunity to live in public housing. Some were happy to stay, and others felt like they wanted to stabilize and then move to privately provided housing. Some were concerned about their safety, and others were concerned about redevelopment of public housing. Eviction came up a lot. You have at VCU a very excellent research unit that's taken a look at the impact of evictions on particularly African American and Black households, as well as the neighborhoods where there are a lot of evictions and what that means for those residents in those neighborhoods. So we were able to use that data and pair that with the stories of people to understand what that means in terms of housing opportunity. Evictions are a major barrier and disproportionately impact African American and Black households, as well as low-income households in general, people who are precariously housed, meaning people who are couch surfing, and they spend time in shelters or transitional housing and be out on the street, as well as single parents. We also did focus group participants. We did focus groups with protected classes, and we did focus groups both in English and in Spanish. We have a native Spanish speaker on staff who ran all of the Spanish-speaking focus groups. We worked through community navigators to get people to participate and rewarded their participation with gift cards, and they told us a lot. I would say your residents are so wonderful to engage with. Always grateful to be in the housing. Many of them were living in publicly subsidized housing or had vouchers or had benefited from publicly subsidized housing, and really talked about the benefit of that, and were grateful for that opportunity. Those who were undocumented status and were not receiving public benefits often lived in very substandard housing. They had rental contracts that put them in really vulnerable situations. They were renting month to month, doubling up, and very, very reluctant to ask landlords for needed repairs because they were afraid they were going to get evicted. We also benefited from a survey that was done of Hispanic Latino participants living in mobile home parks, and then we were able to capture some of their experiences through focus groups in our survey as well. Housing conditions, a very, very big issue there, particularly, really big deficiencies in infrastructure, the sewer system, water system, lack of public lighting, fences in disrepair, and lack of spaces for children to play outside. So housing conditions are really, really big deal, and half of the renters who were surveyed rated their units in fair or poor condition. Again, these are lower income renters who are representing BIPOC populations. The other thing that came up quite a bit was access to quality schools. Of the focus groups that I did, when we talked about a lot of single parents I spoke with, we talked about where they wanted to place their schools. Chesterfield County came up quite a bit. People desired schools in Chesterfield County, but had a lot of trouble finding housing nearby, affordable housing nearby the schools that they would like to get their kids into. We also asked that we were surveying during COVID and doing focus groups during COVID. So we asked about COVID-19 impact. The impacts of COVID-19 among the renters, 99, I guess I feel like we're still in COVID. It's sort of COVID-19 in 20 and 21 now. Among renters, 44% indicated that they needed accommodations from their landlords because of the pandemic. 15% said that they had fees waived, so not a lot. 18% of respondents said work hours were decreased or cut. A lot of people who we talked to were still able to work and had figured out accommodations with their children, and so they were doing okay. But this is early on in the pandemic, so we were doing those focus groups more than a year ago. 15% of respondents said they had to pay for housing costs. They were skipping some payments on bills, paying less than the minimum amount on bills, or taking on debt to manage those housing payments. So again, this was early on in the pandemic when those income supports were still pretty variable, and the eviction moratoriums were also variable. So there wasn't as much stability when we were talking to these folks as we saw a little bit later in the pandemic. I'm going to shift and throw some data at you all. One of the requirements of these studies of the AI is to look at segregation, and HUD provides some measures that the department recommends in looking at segregation. So we did an analysis both of how the composition of the region is changing. We did a lot of mapping to look at where it's changing, and we did a segregation analysis. I'll show you that in just a moment. In general, there's modest changes to the racial and ethnic composition. It's largely due to the growth in Asian residents and Latino Hispanic growth. Segregation overall is mostly declining, and that can be good and it can be not so good if it means that people are getting displaced from the neighborhoods where they have fostered community. Poverty varies quite a bit among your jurisdictions and really among your neighborhoods within jurisdictions, but consistently when we look across jurisdictions, it's highest for single mothers, African American, Black, and Latino and Hispanic households. And there's another measure that we look at called racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. And the idea here is there may be natural clusters, cultural enclaves, places where people or neighborhoods where there is evidence of racial concentration, but it's by choice. People may choose to live by people who look like them. They may want to live near family. And when we lay poverty over that, that's in high poverty, that's when we start to get a little bit nervous. That's an indicator. It signals that people may not be in communities of opportunity. They may choose to live in those neighborhoods, or they may, because their eviction records or because their poor households, may have no other choices. So we look at these RE caps in a really fine grain of detail. Where are they located? What are the characteristics of those neighborhoods in terms of accessing jobs, transportation, quality schools, and what does that mean for resident stability in those neighborhoods? So of the 9 RE caps, and those are neighborhoods with a 40% poverty rate, so a very high poverty rate. Of those 9 RE caps, most are in Richmond, one was in Henrico County, and one's in Petersburg. There's quite a crossover with those formerly redlined neighborhoods. So neighborhoods that were redlined, Christie in the former presentation talked a lot about what that meant in terms of household wealth, but it also really deteriorated those neighborhoods too, because public investment wasn't going into those neighborhoods. Redlining was a signal that it wouldn't be worth investing, it wouldn't be worth the private sector investing in neighborhoods. Those challenges continue to have a negative impact on those neighborhoods. They have higher rates of poverty, many more evictions, as well as mortgage loan denials. So that disinvestment perpetuated a lot of the inequities at the neighborhood level, as well as the household level that we see today. In terms of segregation decreasing, HUD gives us this measure. It's called the dissimilarity index. And we put a little color coding to it to make it easier to understand on this graphic. Low segregation is a measure of 0 to 39. Moderate is 40 to 54, that's that blue shading, and high is 55 to 100. And the way that this is calculated is that HUD looks at the disparities by non-white and white populations, Black and white populations, Hispanic and white populations, and Asian and white populations. And it takes the overall difference in representation in a community and then looks at how that differs by census tract or neighborhood. And when there's a lot of difference, that signals a high level of segregation. So the areas that are red are areas where there has been a high level of segregation. You'll see that's predominantly in Richmond, a little bit in Henrico County for black-white segregation. Overall, however, even when there is a high or moderate level of segregation, that measure is declining. And that, again, can be a really good thing if we know people are seeking housing where they want to, or it could be a bad thing if we know that people are getting displaced or aren't able to get into their stay in the neighborhoods in which they want to live. The other thing we look at is the representation of low-income households among the jurisdictions compared to all households. So this table here, the way to read this is to look at that far right-hand column. This says representation of less than $25,000 households. So we took all the households in the region, we looked at how they're distributed among the participating jurisdictions, and then we compared that with our low-income households, so those with incomes of $25,000 and less, and looked at where there's a difference. And in the city of Richmond, there are far more very low-income households than what we would anticipate if we compare that to households overall. The reverse is true in Chesterfield and Henrico County. And so that tells us that there may not be enough opportunity for low-income households to find housing in Chesterfield and Henrico counties. I want to shift a little bit and talk about this from the perspective of the person. So what does that data mean when we think about the perspective of the average African American household or the average Latino Hispanic household in the region? So when I take all of these data points and I look at what does that really mean, a day in the life? If I'm an African American resident living anywhere in the region, I'm twice as likely to be severely cost burdened, meaning I'm paying 50% or more of my income to housing costs. I'm 2.5 times more likely to live in housing in poor condition. I'm also 2.5 times more likely to be denied housing. I'm 2 times more likely to live in public housing than what demographics, so income levels, would suggest. And that's largely because I haven't been able to access housing in the private market, affordable housing in the private market over time. I'll talk about this difference in equity in just a moment. We have a nice graphic that demonstrates that. I'm also twice as likely to be denied a home mortgage loan and 3.25 times more likely to get a subprime loan if I'm able to get a mortgage loan. If I'm a Latino Hispanic household, those differences still exist. They're not as great for an African American Black household, but they still exist. I'm basically 2 times more likely to be severely cost burdened, 2.5 times more likely to live in housing in poor repair condition. I'm denied housing. I'm denied housing more than a white household, but not as much as a Black African American household. Same with mortgage loans. But my subprime loans and my high cost loan difference in proportion is the same as an African American Black household. The denial that we looked at, these denial rates come right out of that survey that we did. And we were able, and I mentioned when we get enough representation by protected class, we're able to cross-tab that and look at how does that vary not only by the region, but by race and ethnicity. And so this graphic here shows you that variation. We looked at variation in denials by jurisdiction, race, ethnicity, living situation, income, and household characteristics. And just a couple things that I wanted to draw your attention to. Residents in Henrico and Richmond were more likely to say that they had been denied housing. African Americans are much more likely, as well as Hispanic households, to say that they had been denied housing. And then people who are precariously housed, so those who are couch surfing, who don't have stable places to live. And also people with low incomes. With household characteristics, it was pretty much across the board. Children, families with children, large households, single parents, and disabilities, all about a quarter of those said they were denied housing. Similarly, when we look at home ownership gaps, so this shows differences in home ownership among the representative jurisdictions in the region, where you see the very small rates of home ownership are typically with Black households, regardless of the jurisdiction, and then secondarily Hispanic households. when we step back and we look at what does that mean, these differences, how does that impact a household over time? We benefited from a couple of really emerging and very well done studies that took a look at that. So they looked at, and we replicated those studies. These were global studies, national studies. We replicated those for the Richmond region. We looked at we were able to really look specifically at the detrimental impacts of segregation on wealth building. So we took the same household living in a similar type of housing unit, but for the characteristics of the neighborhood, and looked at how their equity would change over time because of this devaluation of those neighborhoods. That devaluation is built into the cost of the land and the algorithms that make a lot of these lending decisions. And what we concluded is that by 2050, so we started in 2016, a household living in a majority African American community would have $45,000 less equity than the same household living in a non-majority neighborhood. And that's not a very long time period. So when you consider the impact of that over the many decades of discrimination, particularly discrimination in home ownership, it's really easy to understand the data that Christie showed on that humongous gap in wealth. Access to opportunity refers to, this is where we look at the neighborhood level and we look by protected class. How easy is it to access high quality schools, to access a good job, to live around people who are employed, who have children in high quality schools, as well as how to access transportation to get me to these things that we know elevate households. Big picture with quality education, Chesterfield County educates the largest number of students. The biggest barrier there, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the folks we talked to really wanted to put their kids in schools in Chesterfield County, couldn't find affordable housing. We also looked at differences in school quality among students of color. We found the biggest disparities in the city of Richmond and Henrico County. We also identified differences in passing rates by race and ethnicity and school suspensions. So in the city of Richmond, African American and Black students are around 10 times more likely to be suspended as non-Hispanic white students. And we know from research that's being done that that has detrimental impacts on those students as they continue their education and into adulthood. In terms of employment, non-white and Hispanic households are more likely to hold lower paying jobs, more likely to be unemployed, and these disparities translate into lower incomes. A lot of good jobs in Chesterfield County and Henrico County, and these counties provide a nice opportunity for residents to be close to the places of employment and to continue to be promoted through those jobs. However, they're hard to get to. So they lack affordable housing in many areas, and they're hard to get to if you don't have a car because of the lack of transportation. We also, and HUD calculates the odds of living near major employment centers. I haven't talked a lot about Colonial Heights or Hopewell or Petersburg, but we took a look at the dynamics among those cities in terms of economic development, this kind of push-pull in wooing major corporations, challenges in being kind of transitioning from being providers of government goods a long time ago and trying to figure out how to reinvent for the current economy, and found that residents that are living in these communities have lower access to high quality employment because of those economic development challenges that exist in those areas. And then a bit about transportation, disability, and community health, all of which have a lot of attention in the report. I mentioned troubles with the public transportation system and that it's hard for people to get around. Lines have been cut in some areas, and it's hard to get to places of employment, major places of employment. We had a lot of conversations with residents with disabilities. Many of whom I talked to were housed. In the resident survey, we found that many live in poor housing condition. Most of the barriers for the people with disabilities who were housed were in mobility. So accessing areas of transportation, sidewalks, so the lack of sidewalks in suburban areas came up quite a bit, as well as accessible transit. But most said, you know, the on-demand system works pretty well when we can schedule it in advance. It takes me the places that I need to get to. I just wish it was easier to get around in general. Last but not least, under access to opportunity, we look at health outcomes and find that there are differences in life expectancies, access to parks and recreation, as well as access to personal financial resources. And that comes both through analysis as well as the survey. So a bit about zoning and land use. I'll go through this quickly because it can be really boring for those of you who are not planners. We looked at every code. So we take a scan of zoning codes in every jurisdiction and identify where they could be improved. And there's a lot of detail on that in the report that I won't replicate here in the interest of time and preserving you from boredom. But in general, you don't have a lot of areas in your region that zone for what we call missing middle unit types. So we've been doing some analysis for a foundation in Colorado, and it's pretty clear based on the data that we've analyzed that both BIPOC populations and low-income populations, renters or owners living in duplex, triplex, fourplex, all the plexes are less likely to be cost burdened. Those units are cheaper for them to both rent and buy. However, in America, we tend to overzone for single-family detached homes, and your region is no different. So we made some recommendations about looking at minimum lot sizes, maximum densities, thinking a little more outside the box about different housing types. There's a really sort of technical aspect of this review too that looks at group homes and where group homes are allowed. And we made some recommendations around defining disability more broadly and allowing group homes more broadly in communities. So big picture, improve diversity of housing types and take a look at some of these technical deficiencies in the code. That's become part of the action plan. So before I take questions, I want to talk a bit about the action plan. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but you can access the plan. I'll give you the link at the very end. These are regional actions, regional barriers and actions, but in the plan there is detail for every single jurisdiction as well as the housing authorities. So primary barriers in rental housing: lack of affordable rental housing, concentration of affordable rentals in certain areas, and we acknowledge that some of this is due to community resistance to affordable housing. We commend you all for the source of income law change. That protection is really, really important. But landlords need some education in order to make sure that they are complying. Over time, just analyzing that law to make sure that it is structured so that it does truly benefit people. That 15-day window of application really isn't as much of a barrier as we think it may be. We also flagged limited federal funding for housing choice vouchers and the growing gap between people who need assistance and the number of vouchers that are available. And then finally, very limited income supports for disabilities and lack of housing. So these gaps that are pretty significant between very low income people, the subsidies they get, and just the reality of the market, like what they can find. Ownership housing barriers, we talked a lot about that in the last presentation. I would invite you to take a look at the denial analysis that we did, and particularly in the city of Richmond, we found the mortgage denial rate is 4 times as high for Black and African American applicants as white applicants. So some definite improvement needs to be made to correct these deficiencies. Happy to hear about that down payment assistance program that was just discussed to make sure that there is equal opportunity or more equal opportunity to build wealth and correct those equity gaps. In terms of awareness, knowledge, and capacity building, I didn't talk much about this other than to acknowledge I think you have a lot of resources, but with a regional study, and the panel will talk a little bit about this, it's always tricky to figure out how do we assign these action items to someone in the region. each jurisdiction has their own action item, but this calls for really more regional coordination and planning. And so we had some recommendations on how that might take place. We also are big believers in getting folks information that came up in the chat in the last presentation. If I don't know how to access programs, if I don't know how to access information about my rights, there's not going to be any change made. I'm not going to do anything about it. And so continuing and committing to funding fair housing education and outreach, and then building upon those effective places in the region. And making this information available to city councils, county commissions, affordable housing committees, actually taking it and doing something with it. On access to opportunity, let me talk a little bit about rental housing first. Strengthening funding for eviction mediation and diversion programs. You've got some effective programs already in place. Don't let those go. Looking at piloting a regional landlord do no harm fund. We've seen this effective in other jurisdictions to incentivize landlords to house tenants that are perceived as high risk. Those would include people with criminal backgrounds or evictions. It's really hard to find housing if you have any of those on your record. And then looking at rental rehabilitation programs and bolstering those. The other thing that we had around the ownership idea is to convene a group of lenders, community development financial institutions, people who study this stuff, the Federal Reserve, and really think hard about this home ownership gap. As I mentioned earlier, a number of studies have come out that have signaled that there are some structural issues with the algorithms that make those decisions, those loan decisions, and deny people credit. And there needs to be some big thinking and some fixes around that. We also wanted to give a nod to the regional land trust homeownership model, which can correct a lot of these inequities. In terms of access to opportunity, I was just delighted to find this Confronting School and Housing Segregation. The Richmond region study had a lot of very, very good ideas and big ideas about how to close the gaps in the education system. So we didn't go any further than to say, implement the recommendations in the study. It's very well done. It's exactly what needs to get done. And then, furthering a regional transportation vision and balancing that vision with the very real aspects of displacement that can occur if you do too much around transportation. So thinking hard about how to provide more equity in transportation and balance that with displacement. And then last but not least, before I take a few questions and I turn everything over to the panel, this is where to find the AI. It's easy to Google. You can Google Greater Richmond Tri-Cities Analysis of Impediments for Housing Choice. It's a really long document, but it's got some infographics and some maps to capture your attention. And again, at the very end is all the action items that the jurisdictions that participated in the study are working on. So I think there are a couple of questions in the chat. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And let me see if I can open up the chat. And I'll just acknowledge those before I turn over to the panel here. One question, were there any tenants and owners of manufactured housing units and communities who participated? Yes, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I could pull that from the survey data. We worked with Araceli Harris and her group she took surveys to folks, had some one-on-one conversations, and then there was a study that was done, and I'm forgetting who did that. There was a survey that was done in the manufactured home parks, and we analyzed and included that information as well. So that was done prior to us starting this study. There's a question about how much of the bias is due, or how much of the discrepancy is due to the bias of appraisers. I'm actually not sure about that. That's a really good question. Most of the differences in values that I have seen that have connected those to an appraiser, there's anecdotal studies. We did a regional study in Baltimore about a year prior to this one. I would say in that case, we did a focus group with realtors who talked a lot about that appraisal gap, particularly with attached housing, but I don't know of any studies that have really looked at that question from a quantitative perspective. And I think that should be done, absolutely. And then last but not least, there's a comment that fair housing agencies need more federal, local, and state funding to combat housing discrimination, and aggressive testing is needed like never before. And I would certainly agree with that. I didn't mention testing, but I think that testing is very, very valuable in really understanding what's going on, because unfortunately, the private sector and some bad actors have gotten a little smarter about how to engage in discriminatory activity, and it does take pretty sophisticated testing to uncover that. Sometimes it's hard to see these things in data, including some of the appraisal barriers. And then I'll take one more, and then I'm going to turn it over to the panel. What's the incentive for the majority to support equal access of housing and all the perks that come with it? That's an excellent question. It's something that we think about a lot. We have a couple of economists, Aggele, who did the modeling showing the homeownership gap. We've been looking at this in terms of how to argue that communities in general benefit if they create opportunity. I think part of that is just the basic argument that we are a consumer-oriented economy. If people have more money to spend, the economy generally does better. Over time, when people are educated, when they're living in areas of opportunity, they tend to make more money. Ensuring that your populations are well educated, that they're ready to enter the labor force, that they're happy in their jobs, they're happy in their lives, they can buy a home. Really, that leads to tremendous economic benefits. The problem, I think, is that goes beyond that council member's elected term, and so that long-term view is really not part of decision making. And then one last question that I'll take. Discrimination practices in housing communities when someone's here legally versus undocumented. I can take a look at that, Frank. I think we may have some of that data. Aggele may know off the top of her head. And there's a question about missing middle housing in single family zone plots while ensuring affordable housing is created. A really good program is being piloted in the city of Austin. So they are they are allowing by right construction of duplexes to an 8-plex if there's an affordability component to it. So, and they're quite successful in that. Shivaughn, I'll turn it back to you to move on to the panel. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Heidi, for your great work and your impressive AI. I want to invite to the stage Dan Cohen, Eric Leabough, Brandi Payne, and Mike MacKenzie to have a conversation in response to Heidi's presentation, and to talk more about what's going on. Dan, I'm going to pass it to you. Do you mind sharing a little bit about who you are, and then turn it over to your colleague? Sure. Before you go, though, Dan, audience, while they're talking, please feel free to put into the question and answer chat or box any questions you may have, and if we have time, we will get to them. All right, go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Shivaughn. My name is Dan Cohen. In my day job, I'm Director of Community Enhancement for Chesterfield County, Virginia. And I also at the moment get to be the chair of ULI Virginia, who has a mission for the next couple of years to deal with and address affordable housing. Eric, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Dan.
Sure.
Eric Leabough, I'm with Henrico County. I'm Dan's counterpart in Henrico. I'm the Director of Community Revitalization, and happy to be a part of this panel.
Brandi and guest.
Yeah, I'm Brandi Payne. This is Leanne. She's a month old. And I'm with the City of Colonial Heights. I'm the assistant bird chirping. So, yeah, I'm with the City of Colonial Heights. And I am the Assistant Director of Planning and Community Development there.
And last, Mike MacKenzie, please.
Hi, I'm Mike MacKenzie. I have a 2-month-old, so I'm very much in sympathy with Brandi here. But I work at VCU as a researcher, as well as the director of the Land Use Education Program. And prior to that, I worked at Housing Opportunities Made Equal as a researcher.
So we definitely will not have any discriminatory practices against people with children. Okay, so Heidi, thank you very much, by the way. It was really a pleasure working with you. I think all our regional partners would agree that what you put together was just a wonderful document and public participation effort. Now, you mentioned regional collaboration. Can the panelists, anybody, can you tell us a little bit more about the process, who was involved, and what it looked like to collaborate as regional partners? Because this was a rare effort for many jurisdictions to get together and actually produce this kind of document. Brandi, I may look at you first. If you can help me out with that one, it would be great.
Sure, yes. It started with, I hope I get his name right, David Sachs in Henrico County. He reached out to us. HUD has these regional meetings like once or twice a year. And he knew that the analysis of impediments was due for every locality except Richmond. And so basically he convinced everyone to do a regional AI. And it was really gracious of the city of Richmond because theirs wasn't due for another year. And they still agreed to come on and do the regional report with us. So basically we all came together and we discussed kind of like what we wanted out of the report and what kind of company we were looking for to do the report. And we put out a RFP, a request for proposal, and we got some really good submissions. And then Root came through and they basically did the report, the regional report for all of us. And so it was a really good experience. I thoroughly enjoyed working with all the localities.
Thanks. So, regional cooperation is a nebulous concept, but because each locality can argue that they have different needs. So what's the significance, do you think, of doing a regional AI instead of a single jurisdiction, like, for instance, in Colonial Heights?
I think
Eric, Brandi, whomever.
Yeah, sure. I think the significance is that we get the opportunity to see the similarities and the differences and then just pull resources together, similar to what we did for the report itself. We can see, okay, well, this person has a single family housing issue and not enough apartments or townhomes. Maybe we can work collaboratively on getting that resolved within both localities. And a lot of times, everyone says Richmond is small, but also big at the same time. And a lot of times it's the same people you'll be working with. And so it was just an opportunity to really just come together and see what can we do together.
So, Eric, in your opinion, what were the findings in the AI that most stood out for you, and why do you think that?
So the one finding that I think stood out is just the acknowledgement that we're all doing, we're doing a good job, especially in Henrico, in terms of balancing housing options. It was found that we have a good distribution of housing types, but it also shed some light on some of the things that we could improve upon. One of the things that stood out is the high share of vouchers that I guess presented a barrier to people accessing, mainstream housing in terms of their denial of access. So that stood out. The other thing that stood out really kind of centered around the number of people that were denied mortgages. And it speaks to the fact that we need to do more around education. And we also need to do more to help people, whether it be from a credit background or credit history perspective or housing history perspective, whatever we need to do to educate them about the important steps to take to make sure that when they apply for a mortgage, that they can actually obtain it. But also educating those lenders about the importance of lending to people who may not have, 850 credit scores. I mean, how it's important to everyone to have the ability to access quality housing. The other thing that kind of came out of that process and looking at the findings was that we're doing a lot of good work. We're funding some of the programs that were mentioned. We're funding down payment assistance programs. We're funding housing opportunities made equal for housing stability programs. We're funding Central Virginia legal aid to help tenants who are facing housing challenges. But what it also speaks to, and we're also funding Maggie Walker Community Land Trust, like you all, Dan, in Chesterfield, but it also speaks to the fact that we need to do more. And we need to figure out ways to collaborate. And to go back to your prior question, in terms of why is it important? There may be, we have finite resources, but there may be things that you're doing well that we should know about and vice versa. And we can build upon those efforts where if Chesterfield's focusing on one particular initiative, maybe we should focus on something slightly different, or maybe we should all be doing the same thing.
So one of the things that Heidi mentioned was AIs are designed to help local leaders make better policy choices. I think as staff members, we understand the importance. However, sometimes I think there's a disconnect between us as staff and perhaps our local officials, and I work for local government. Who would like to answer the question about how could we do a better job to make our local leadership more aware of what Heidi talked about so eloquently today?
I can try to field that one. That's a tricky one. I think it's important that when we talk about local officials, we understand a lot of the time that they are, say, planning commissioners, BZA members, board of supervisors members. They're members of the public first and foremost, and representatives of the public, and often require and need the same amount of information, education as any of us on a lot of these issues, which can be at times difficult to really grasp initially. Certainly, some of the bigger elements of it. So I think it's important to work with members of decision makers, leaders, in incorporating this stuff into just everyday conversation, everyday decision making as we move forward. So it's not just we have an analysis of impediments over here separately. It's that we talk about these things of issues of segregation and disparate access issues as part of our everyday decision making.
These items, however, Mike, are very difficult to talk about, and I think that's sometimes why perhaps there might be a little bit of a disconnect. Can you talk a little bit about what Heidi referred to, if you don't mind, about access to education and the importance of the housing issue and fair housing issue to quality education and employment?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times we say, or it's been said that your zip code can determine your outcomes in terms of what zip code you're born into, and it's even more specific than that. A lot of times, it's what block you're born on, what street you're born on, and a lot of that has to do with the access that you have to education, to transportation, to get to employment, to all of these things, housing in particular. And so when we say access to those things is a fair housing issue, what we're saying is that if you're unable to access housing in a neighborhood that has these opportunities based on your income, based on your race, based on any number of protected status, it's absolutely a fair housing issue that you can't access the same opportunities as other people because of your protected status.
Yet at the same time, of course, one of the findings that Heidi made in her effort was we still have a tremendous amount of segregation, in our jurisdiction. So, how do we address segregation in the region, and the patterns, and then make changes there so we can actually get better access to education? And Brandi, you may want to chime in here as well as Mike, either one of you, or Eric.
Can you repeat that question one more time?
Sure. I mean, one of the findings, was that segregation is decreasing within the region, yet it remains high in some jurisdiction. How do we address segregation in the region, and how can we begin to address it in a way that actually improves access to education?
I think one thing is you have to just first off just look at the numbers. The numbers don't lie. One thing that I saw with our report is that the numbers that Heidi was coming up with in our report for root policy with the AI was the same numbers that we came up with when we were doing our comprehensive plan for the city. And so that was one thing that our planning commission and our city council had to reconcile with, is that the city of Colonial Heights is becoming less white. And so that was something that they had to see for themselves. And so that's the first step. And then secondly is just to acknowledge that the people here are now your constituents, and that you have to now provide for them. And so I think that's just the first step, is the acknowledgement that your community is changing. And then also that it's not what it once was. Some people still have the belief that the city of Colonial Heights is, just predominantly white with, 2-parent households, 2 children, and that's it. But that's slowly changing. It's still very much there, but that is slowly changing. And you'll see that in the root policy report in the Colonial Heights section, but also as well as our comprehensive plan, is that it's changing. And you just have to recognize that and begin to accommodate for those changes. With that comes another thing they also had a hard time accepting was a lower income that is in the city of Colonial Heights as well. Colonial Heights is primarily retail. And so the most highest type of jobs you're going to have is like retail managers, assistant managers, things like that. And so accepting that type of income is going to be pretty much the majority of your city, you have to adjust for those findings and how you plan your city, especially in schools. Some kids may not come as prepared as another school district may have for their children.
So pivoting back to the relationship between housing and schools, some of you may be aware that there's an organization that first took root in Atlanta called Purpose-Built Communities that actually really delves into the relationship between schools and housing. And in the redevelopment of some public housing in Atlanta, through the beneficence of a major developer, actually began to develop a lot of mixed income housing and some schools attached to it. In fact, there's a high school, an elementary school, there was a YMCA, and even a 9-hole golf course. The schools became so good that the waiting list for the middle income housing units actually is larger than for the lower income housing units. And Mike, I don't know if you take this, but how can we develop perhaps some more middle income housing or more integrated housing? Because I think we all know that if we have communities that have mixed incomes, that the kids just do better in schools.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's important to have, especially now as we see a lot of demographic shifts in the city of Richmond and Colonial Heights and a lot of these places. A mixed income housing is essential. And there's a number of different aspects of that are important, but I would say one of the most important is the preservation of affordable housing. So the affordable housing we have now, be it through HUD contracts or contracts through the Virginia Housing or some other time limited contract. We have to watch those contracts to make sure that they're not running out or close to running out. And if they are, how do we ensure that those multifamily units stay affordable? And beyond that, I think we have to build. And there were just such a regional deficit of housing units since even 2008 that it's crucial to build when we can, wherever we can.
Thanks. So again, one of the things that Heidi mentioned, and Eric, you touched on it a little bit as well. We get into this situation where we want to talk about housing as access to wealth and wealth building. Just had an evaporation of our eviction protection. We still have some funds floating around and in the region for emergency rental assistance and such. but there's, so how can we continue on a housing front to build wealth? And Eric, maybe you'd like to answer this at the same time that we recognize that we have to protect our ability to try and keep the residents in place who are suffering the most because of the pandemic.
Yeah, so I mentioned this a little bit earlier in that funding organizations like Maggie Walker Community Land Trust, Better Housing Coalition, Project Homes, Housing Opportunities Made Equal, funding organizations that a part of their mission is wealth building in the community, giving access to home ownership options to populations that have not been able to access those opportunities is definitely critical to that process. But what the pandemic has shown us is that we really need to make sure that we keep people stably housed and that they don't develop those tenancy histories that could prevent them or hurt them in the future as they pursue ownership or other options. But again, making sure that people have equal access to home ownership opportunities should they choose. And if they don't choose home ownership, that they're in housing that meets their needs and that's safe and standard and it's not run down or dilapidated. Also, I want to go back to zoning that came up, making sure that we have policies and practices that don't create a gap in terms of access to options in the community for people of all income levels. That's a critical piece in making sure that missing middle is an option for people. And those folks that have challenges or a checkered background from a rental or home ownership perspective, making sure that we're putting policies and programs in place that can help bridge that gap so that one life crisis doesn't scar you for life in terms of the ability to access quality housing in the future, which we know that has been the case for some folks that have had a car breakdown to get behind on their rent, and now that background follows them, or they're evicted one time because of some crisis, and it makes it harder and harder for them to get back on their feet.
So can you just take a little bit of a deeper dive for a second, Eric, if you don't mind? Chesterfield and Henrico put a lot of their dollars into the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust, who acts as the land bank for at least our two entities, as well as the city. Can you talk for a moment about that model and how it helps build wealth?
Yes, so the model with the traditional home purchase, the buyer typically buys the property. And when I say the property, the buyer typically buys the land, the dirt, and as well as the improvement. But with the community land trust model, it's a model that really reduces or backs out the land cost as a part of the transaction, which thereby makes the unit or the home more affordable in that the home buyer is only purchasing the improvement. Of course, they have lifetime rights. So as long as they want to live there, they don't have to move or anything like that. But in that scenario, not only does it provide the opportunity to people that may not be able to afford the purchase of the land and the improvement, it gives a greater level of affordability. But I think the key piece to that program is that it offers perpetual affordability to others who come behind that initial home buyer, and that savings or that equity that would normally be paid to the seller of the property, and they take it on to the next opportunity. That equity, at least 50% of it, is retained in that home or in that property. So then when the next purchaser comes in line to buy the home, it's still made affordable to that subsequent purchaser and the subsequent purchaser after that. So there's some beauty in that model in that it creates the opportunity for wealth building for people who may not or may have been closed out of that process based on income or other factors. The other thing that I know that Land Trust is looking at and they've started to do is sort of a rental to ownership model to bridge that gap for people who are further challenged in terms of getting into the ownership market. Mm-hmm. It's a great program. I know Dan, you all support it, we support it. We like to grow that model along with other models to create that opportunity to build wealth. And that's something that people who are nothing against renters, but when you're renting, that opportunity doesn't exist for you. And that's the unique part of the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust model.
And also the initial subsidy goes on in perpetuity, which is really what I like, because the reliance on any kind of federal or local government assistance is not necessary over time.
Absolutely.
One of the questions that somebody put in the chat box, and it's a really good one, is how would we define what affordable housing is? And so before I open that up, let me just say that I've stopped using the term affordable housing because I think it actually stigmatizes it. It's just housing for different people at different price points is what that is. And I don't know, Mike, I don't know, Eric or Brandi, if you'd like to weigh in on your communities, how you talk about the issue of affordable housing and perhaps how we can destigmatize it.
You know, I in terms of stigma, I feel like any stigma attached to it is well, okay, let me begin again. Affordable, often, you know, the question is always affordable to whom? And we've generally defined that as not constituting more than 30% of a person's income. And often, if you pull that out through a lot of the census data, you'll find that it tends to be, obviously as your income category goes lower, the amount that constitutes affordable is harder and harder to achieve. So when we talk about affordable housing, we're often constrained by federal rules surrounding subsidies that go to different income categories or different, basically different income categories at 80% of the area median or 60% of the area median. And really that's where the conversation happens. I think changing the language absolutely is a great idea. We still end up needing to talk about things in terms of the way that these rules are set up at the federal level, where so much of the money for housing kind of flows from at the start. That being said, I don't really feel like there's anything wrong with to talk about affordability. I mean, so much of our housing stock today, people will pay outrageous sums for. I mean, might have started out as affordable housing. It just happens to be the amenities that are around there, the neighborhood, oftentimes more so than the house.
So 2 more questions. I think that's about what we have enough time for. What solutions do you think are easier to achieve given the politics in the region, and where do we go from here? And I'll open up that to all 3 of you, please. Any takers?
Well, I would say, I mean, a big piece of this is education. Educating, people that make decisions about housing policy, educating them about the need and some of the barriers and challenges that people face when it comes to accessing housing. So I think the educational component of it is the sort of the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. The other challenge we'll have is really kind of, again, making sure that people understand the programs that are out there. So the folks that need access to these resources, making sure that we can educate them about the resources that are available. We tend to know a lot about the programs and take for granted that everyone else in the community does. So we could probably do a better job. So I think that's something that's easy to achieve, continuing to leverage our resources because they're finite, leveraging other resources from the philanthropic community, making sure that they understand the need. So sharing these types of reports, I think that's sort of the low hanging fruit, but also, Dan, you all are kind of working with developers, owners of properties, through like agreements to make sure that the preservation aspect that Mike mentioned, the preservation of affordability is continuing so that we won't start to see a decrease in the number of, and I hate to use the word, but the affordable units that are out there, that we don't go backwards, and also continuing to educate people about the need above and beyond that, which came out of that regional framework that we wrapped up. I guess it was in February. Was it last year, Dan?
It was
losing
last
track of
year. Yeah.
COVID. Yeah, it was right before COVID.
Mhm.
Making sure that we don't lose ground, but also recognize that there's so much more work to be done. Funding, the state housing credits and making sure that people are taking advantage of those and other resources that are out there, like the rent relief program that you all administer, Dan, and also the state rent relief program, making sure that people are tapping into that so we don't lose ground in terms of keeping people housed.
I also think it's incumbent upon us to build not only the relationships among the various local jurisdictions, but figuring out a way to make sure we continue to partner with our state agencies, on these kinds of issues as well. Mike, Brandi, are there any last words you'd like to mention here before we close?
I don't have anything too much to add to what Eric and Mike covered, but I think just it's important to always celebrate the small wins. I know we can always be very siloed in our communities. And so I think it's just a huge win for us to even just be having this discussion after having the AI report come out, and really looking forward to have active steps of working together.
Okay, Mike, anything you want to add?
I would echo Brandi's feelings about the jurisdictions working together. I'm excited to see regional discussion.
Okay, so with that, Shivaughn, I know we have a little bit of a break, but I'd like to turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Dan. This was a great conversation, and I really enjoyed getting to know both you, Eric and Dan, and Mike and Brandi. It's always great to be on the same team again. Team Home, Team Fair Housing. We do have a 15-minute break, so if everyone go ahead and grab lunch or grab some water or something and come back and join us at 3:30, and I'll have a presentation for you on discrimination in the real estate sales market.
Okay,
Thanks again, y'all.
Thank you all.
All right, everyone, we are going to get started today. Good afternoon. We're on the final home stretch. I appreciate everyone who attended today and who's still here. This afternoon, we're going to talk about real estate sales transactions and potential fair housing challenges. I'm Shivaughn Ferguson. I'm the Director of Fair Housing here at Home of Virginia, and I have been in fair housing for about 9 years, and until most recently, 7 of those years, I was working at the National Fair Housing Alliance on the Fair Housing Enforcement team, doing the work at the national level. So I'm happy to be back at Home of Virginia. For those who are new to home and to fair housing, a little bit about Home of Virginia before we get started. Home of Virginia is a statewide nonprofit civil rights organization whose mission is to ensure equal access to housing for all people. And we do that through 3 departments. The housing counseling team, which helps hundreds of buyers and renters access housing opportunities each year. They work with clients interested in becoming a home buyer, clients who are at risk of foreclosure, voucher holders who just need help navigating the rental process, and renters experiencing housing instability. And so when we see discrimination in the sales market, especially, this definitely has an impact on the hard work of our housing counselors and the clients who are trying to access housing in the homes and communities that they seek. We have a research and policy team, which works to ensure that we have robust laws and legislation that geared towards both fair housing and just housing in general. They work on research that supports our organization needs, but also partner with other organizations to make sure that we can provide research related to housing. And then we have our Fair Housing Department, which is the team that I'm on. The Fair Housing Department is focused on ensuring that clients, consumers, and landlords understand their fair housing rights and fair housing obligations. And we do that by providing fair housing trainings, hosting events like this. It's important that people understand the fair housing laws to ensure that they do not break the fair housing laws. We also conduct investigations, which can support research that go into reports. And we also conduct investigations when there might be an allegation of housing discrimination. And when we do find that our investigations support the allegation of discrimination, we can help a client, a complainant, seek justice by advocating for them through different enforcement options so that we can make sure that bad apples are held accountable for unlawful behavior. So I saw in the chat that there are a few people who are new to fair housing. So before I go into sales discrimination, I wanted to take a step back and kind of get everyone on the same page. So I'm going to do a quick Fair Housing 101 for those who are new. So for those who are more familiar with fair housing, I appreciate your patience while we get everyone up to speed. So in 1965, Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference led the Chicago Freedom Movement campaign to expand the civil rights protections. As Dr. King said in 1965, in the South, we always had segregationists to help make issues clear. We knew where segregationists stood. But in the North, discrimination was still an issue. It just looked different. Dr. King wanted to make apparent that Black residents were not welcome in white Northern neighborhoods either. And so by the summer of 1966, the campaign organized marches through all white neighborhoods and was met with harassment from white residents at a level of hostility and hate that even Dr. King had not experienced before that moment. So in addition to demonstrations, Dr. King wanted to show legislators that discrimination was happening in the North as well. And so what he did is he employed his staff, white staff and Black staff, to inquire about housing and see what happens. And what he found was that his white staff were steered to white neighborhoods and his Black staff were steered to Black neighborhoods. And he used this information to, at the time, try to advocate for what he called at that time open housing. That the method that he used is what we now call testing, and we now call open housing fair housing. Unfortunately, Dr. King was assassinated and wasn't able to see, his hard work come into fruition with the passage of the Fair Housing Act. The next slide I'm going to show you is a video. The video is called 7 Days. It's going to walk us through the journey of the passage of the Fair Housing Act and the importance of the Fair Housing Act. The video was produced by Nationwide, who partnered with the National Fair Housing Alliance to educate consumers about the Fair Housing Act and the importance of the Fair Housing Act.
Few in the nation believe that fair housing would in our time become the unchallenged law of this land. And indeed, this bill has had a long and stormy trip.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man.
Ladies and gentlemen, Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
The death of the prophet of nonviolence set off the worst outbreak of arson, looting, and criminal activity in the nation's history. Washington's ghettos burned within a few blocks of the nation's capital.
The life of a man who symbolized the freedom and faith of America has been taken. And no words of mine can fill the void of the eloquent voice that has been stilled. This I do believe deeply. The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him.
President Johnson was willing to speak up and say, we have to pass a fair housing bill.
Hello, Mr. President? Yes, Dick. We're in trouble. We need some help. Yes? I'm afraid of that.
Federal troops, for the first time since the Civil War, took up positions to guard government buildings.
Nothing's probably touchier than your own neighborhood and your own home or your own apartment. The administration, which supported the bill, said this has no chance. The other stuff is okay, but this will kill any politician that touches it.
Well, I just could not live beside them. I don't feel that they should be oppressed, but I moved here because it was a white community.
I have 2 daughters and 2 sons, and if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out.
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they're allowed to move in here in any number.
It seems as though our country is pulling apart into separate societies, where whites have jobs and Negroes have unemployment, where the middle class lives in suburbs and the poor are left in the ghettos, where one group of Americans looks upon another group of Americans with growing mistrust and even dread.
Then the bill went over into the House Rules Committee, and under the chairmanship of the famous Judge Smith, a right-wing segregationist from Virginia, he wouldn't hold hearings on it. He would take the bill home so nobody could act on it, and we were running out of time.
Thousands flowed through the rainy streets of Memphis this day, finishing a march that Dr. King planned to lead in support of striking garbage workers.
How many men must die before we can really have a free and true and peaceful society?
For your presence, Lord. And I know you'll reach out and take mine. You take our hand.
The death of Martin Luther King is a tragic thing, but no legislation should be passed as a memorial to anyone.
In spite of the riots, I am going to support this legislation with all the vigor that I possess.
The laws that we pass up here are for all time. The Martin Luther Kings come and go.
The public reaction to this horror gave the sensible members of the committee a compelling argument that the House Rules Committee had to report that bill out. And I think that's how we got our bill. They just didn't dare bottle it up any longer.
And I have a dream that one day Negroes will be able to buy a house anywhere that their money will carry them.
At long last this afternoon, fair housing for all is now a part of the American way of life. Democracy's work is being done, and the bell of freedom rings out a little louder. We have come some of the way, not near all of it.
The fight still goes on because we unfortunately have the laws, but we don't have the enforcement. That we have changed, but we still have the same kinds of discrimination.
The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights said today that efforts by federal agencies to end housing discrimination have been generally superficial or incomplete.
President Carter has ordered federal agencies to use all means possible to strengthen fair housing programs.
For the first time, people with disabilities and families with children will be protected from housing discrimination.
President Reagan signed legislation today designed to toughen up the nation's fair housing laws.
Why did you take part in this demonstration today? Just because there was a huge crowd, or did you have any personal reason?
Well, I took part in this march today because of Martin Luther King and what he stood for, because this march is what he died for.
You know what he stood for?
Yes. He stood for nonviolence and peace for all men of all kinds. And I think if he died for it, I could carry out what he started.
So I share this video when I give most presentations because to me, it's important that we are grounded in the importance of fair housing and all that it took for us to get here. When my parents were born, they were born into a world where housing discrimination was lawful. And I was born into a world where it was unlawful. But discrimination still occurs. And sometimes it looks like it did 50 years ago, and sometimes it doesn't. But it still exists and it still has long-term consequences. Fortunately, we do have the Fair Housing Act that allows people who do experience discrimination and are able to prove that they experience discrimination, they can, seek justice. There's an avenue for them to seek justice. The Fair Housing Act, as you saw, means it's unlawful to discriminate in housing. So what does that mean? What specifically does it mean to engage in discriminatory behavior? Well, it means when you choose to discriminate against somebody based off the protected class, that discrimination could look like refusal to sell or rent a home because of X protected class. I'm not going to sell to you because of the color of your skin, because of your race. Offering different terms and conditions. In the sales context, that could look like requiring that one home seeker show a real estate agent a pre-approval or pre-qualification letter before that real estate agent shows them any homes, and yet not requiring that of another home seeker. And when we see a pattern that's based off of a protected class, that would be unlawful. We talked about steering a lot today. So steering is explicitly mentioned as a potential violation. Misrepresenting availability of housing. So saying a real estate agent saying that a house is not for sale when in actuality it is for sale. Advertising a preference or limitation. So it's, it was a few years ago, right before I left home the first time, I remember that there was somebody had posted a sign outside their house in Virginia that said whites only. Still happens, either verbally or in writing. Threatening, intimidation, or coercion. So, threatening or harassing somebody in their neighborhood or a home buyer because of their protected class, harass them trying to get them to move out, are because people who engage in discrimination are so creative. Fortunately, the Fair Housing Act includes this particular language, or make housing otherwise unavailable because of someone's protected class status. Now, of course, it has to be because of someone's protected class status. So what does that mean? Well, there's federal protected classes. There are 7 federal protected classes. So anywhere in the United States and its territories, it's unlawful to discriminate against somebody based off of these protected classes: race, color, national origin, gender, religion, familial status, and disability. Now, that is based off of both how I identify, but also how you perceive me to be. So just because, I am Black and Mexican, but if you perceive me to be from another country and you choose to not to sell a home to me because of your perception, just because you're wrong doesn't mean you did not violate the Fair Housing Act. There's still protections on that. If you assume that I have children and choose not to rent to me, you're still in the wrong. It's still a violation of the Fair Housing Act. But state and localities may have additional protections. They have to obviously have these 7 federally protected classes in their local fair housing laws, but they may choose to expand protections for their constituents. And in Virginia, we've done a great job of having additional protections. So we have 5 additional protections here in Virginia: source of funds, sexual orientation, gender identity, military status, and elderliness, which is defined as 55 and older. If you want more information about these protections, you can go to the Virginia Fair Housing Office's website. They have a really great resource and information about that. You can also go to Home of Virginia's website, homeofva.org, to learn more about what these protections mean. The purpose of the Fair Housing Act was to eliminate housing discrimination, of course. But what people tend to forget is that the other purpose is to promote residential integration. And that speaks to what the panel before us and Heidi's presentation is about, making sure that local governments are encouraging, are making sure that we are creating inclusive communities with the federal funds that they are provided. People often ask if discrimination still happens. And the answer is yes. The National Fair Housing Alliance estimates that there are over 4 million acts of discrimination that occur each year. And today, NAFA would say that's probably a conservative estimate because only a few people actually report housing discrimination. When we find evidence of discrimination, we usually look for a pattern of discrimination across a series of investigations. And yet, when we do find that, rarely do the testers realize that they actually experience discrimination. They usually leave that encounter and think they had a pleasant encounter, or it was normal or fine. But it took us being able to compare their experience with someone else's experience to notice the difference. And that's why the Supreme Court said that testing is the most reliable way to determine whether or not discrimination is happening. It's important to know whether or not discrimination is happening or is not happening. All right, so that was the Fair Housing 101, the quick one. If you want additional training, if you're an organization or a nonprofit and you want further training, feel free to reach out to us at Home of Virginia and we can do a more extensive fair housing training for you. Housing discrimination continues to be heavily woven into the fabric of housing transactions, as y'all saw earlier in our earlier presentations, and non-white communities continue to be affected. According to a 2016 survey of consumer finances, the median net worth of white households was 10 times greater than that of Black households. So specifically, the median net worth of white households was $171,000. And at the time, the median net worth of Black households was $17,600. The wealth gap between white households and Black households have increased largely due to the foreclosure crisis, which had a disproportionate impact, adverse impact on households of color, and particularly Black households. However, non-white households have systematically been left out of Americans' primary method of building wealth from the beginning.
It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans or the backing for loans to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans, You can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. Tax dollars help make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even one or two non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth. And on another hand, where people were not given access to property did not generate wealth and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
So as you can see, that video articulated well the impact housing discrimination has on generational wealth of non-white communities left out of the housing market. Owning property, as we have said many times today, that it has been the American dream because it's the way Americans build generational wealth in our culture. The homeownership gap between white households and Black households is a spread of about 30 points, which is wider than it was when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, and potentially now wider than it's been since 1900. The Fair Housing Act is significant, but we need to do more. Housing discrimination plays a significant role in this disparity. And since 2016, the wealth gap has continued to widen. The Federal Reserve's Board Survey of Consumer Finances reveals that among Black families, households' net worth has remained in the range of between $15,000 to $25,000 over the last 30 years. In contrast, the net worth for white families has been in the range of $115,000 and $200,000 over the last 30 years. So when we see great disparities like the racial wealth gap and the homeownership gaps between white households and non-white households, we must question what behaviors contribute to it. So let's talk about it through the lens of fair housing and today's real estate market. This is a big topic, and we can probably spend days discussing the barriers of homeownership due to various communities' protected classes. But I decided to focus on the trends that we have seen over the past year, and some of the trends have taken the national spotlight. So recently, it's maybe like a few years ago now, it's not too recent anymore, but Newsday conducted a three-year investigation of 93 real estate agents in Long Island, New York. Those tests were video recorded, and I encourage you to take a look at the report and watch the video on their website, because what the testers experienced is often what we see in real estate testing. For those who work in fair housing, it's also illuminating the level of work and time it takes to conduct a thorough sales investigation. And I will drop a link to the report in the chat at the end of the presentation. And one of the things that they found was that Black testers experienced unequal treatment 49% of the time. And for those of us who do investigations, that wasn't the most shocking. It wasn't a very shocking number. It's a disturbing number, of course. And what I want to do is I'm going to show you one of the videos related to denial of service.
In Newsday's investigation of real estate practices on Long Island, we discovered that agents engaged in disparate treatment that amounted to denial of equal service.
Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another person, but I don't have the time.
They imposed additional stipulations on the minority testers that they did not impose on the white tester. For example, they would tell a minority tester that the minority tester needed to be pre-qualified for a mortgage in order to receive either listings or to get a tour of homes.
So you need that.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Can't even look at listings or anything.
I wouldn't know what to show you.
However, that same stipulation was not imposed on the white tester.
Is it possible to, for you to start sending me some listings?
I can send you listings in those areas.
Particularly, Blacks were on the receiving ends of this unequal treatment.
In one test, Johnny Mae Austin was the Black tester and Cindy Parry was the white tester.
and they met with Anne-Marie Quealy-Bichon at Signature Premier Properties office in Cold Spring Harbor.
You know, I don't know my way around out here.
They asked for the same thing. As often happens, the agent discussed getting pre-qualified or pre-approved for a mortgage by a bank, showing how much a buyer can spend on a house.
You pre-qualified, I asked. My husband's working with somebody in a bank. And he will obtain a pre-approval from the mortgage lender.
Neither had been pre-approved or pre-qualified. Here's what the agent told the black tester.
So I really need that. I won't take out any money unless you have a pre-qualification letter. So I need to know that means I can't pre-qualify for a mortgage. Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another person, but I don't have the time.
And without pre-approval, here's what the agent told the white tester.
What is your availability? When can you start looking at houses? I would say not this coming week.
Cindy received 79 listings from this agent. Johnny May couldn't get any listings.
Let's meet 11:30. Would you rather come with me? Rather than follow me? Okay, good. I'll make sure my car is sparkling for you.
And Cindy, the white tester, received 2 home tours. Bichon did not respond to requests for comment. Another test involved the black tester, Kelvin Toon, who was going to see an agent by the name of Aminta Abarca at Keller Williams in Garden City.
You'll come with your wife and you'll sign the commitment.
Over the course of 2 visits, Abarca stressed the need to sign an exclusive buyer's agreement.
If we have a contract, then I'm working exclusively for you.
Without the contract, she refuses to take him on a tour of homes. So as Kelvin is driving back from his aborted meeting with the agent, Kelvin's counterpart, the white tester, receives a voicemail from the agent asking him when can he go out on a tour of homes.
Hi, David. How are you? This is Aminta. I'm just calling to see if you've started to do some house hunting now that holidays are over.
She ultimately takes the white tester without him signing any kind of exclusive agreement with her.
West Hempstead, we saw 2 in West Hempstead. The 2-family one,
Yeah.
okay?
Right.
And then we saw the beautiful renovated one.
Abarca did not respond to requests for comment. Keller Williams' national spokesman wrote in an emailed statement, Keller Williams does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. All complaints of less than exemplary conduct are addressed and resolved.
I have coordinated more than 12,000 investigations across the country. I have personally done over 1,500 tests. If I go into a real estate office and I say, I'm looking for a house in this price range, I work for this employer and I make this kind of money, generally my word is taken. And I'm not asked to show pay stubs. I'm not asked to go get pre-qualified by a lender. I'm not asked to do a variety of things. But an African-American man matched with me may well be grilled about his financial circumstances, may be asked to be pre-qualified. It suggests that African-Americans and other people of color are not always taken at their word for what they can afford.
In the meantime, I will wait for that pre-approval from your friend or whoever you feel comfortable with. When I get that, I know you are serious about buying.
It certainly has major consequences for that person and their opportunity to obtain housing.
Perez declined comment. The company Perez worked for at the time of the test, Remax LLC, wrote that franchise owners have taken issues raised by Newsday seriously and are committed to following the law and promoting levels of honesty, inclusivity, and professionalism. A law firm representing Douglas Elliman Real Estate, where Perez now works, said Perez dealt more readily with the white tester because he said he consulted a friend working for a mortgage company, while the Asian tester had talked with a friend retired from a mortgage lender. This point is critical, a firm partner wrote. In 7 of Newsday's 86 paired tests, the agent's conduct amounted to a denial of equal service. That affected 5 of Newsday's black testers, 1 Hispanic tester, and 1 Asian tester.
So I saw was told there's a question that in the chat you wanted a link to the video. I'm going to send you the link to the Newsday investigation. Drop it in the chat right now. And you can click on that link and you'll have access to the videos and also the report, which is very illuminating. What's important about this investigation, so one of the people you saw speaking is Fred Freiberger. He's the most former executive director at the Fair Housing Justice Center. And prior to working there, I believe he worked at the DOJ, also working on investigations. The caliber of investigations that come out that office is top notch, they're premium. And because of that, he worked with Newsday to help them develop investigations for this article. For those who are unfamiliar with testing, when you do an investigation, a fair housing test, without going into too much detail of the methodology, you're essentially sending two home seekers who are similar in every way, who can qualify for the same home. And the only variable is whatever protected class you are trying to see if is experiencing discrimination or not. So in that situation, it would be their protected class would be the only variable would be the race. So it's very, the methodology is very, very specific, and it's a high bar to really honestly prove discrimination for litigation or for a fair housing complaint. Appraisal discrimination. I saw in the chat a few times people asked about appraisal discrimination. That has been capturing the national spotlight over the past year, but it's something that's happened for decades. We know it's been happening for decades, and it's interesting because a lot of home seekers who are not white, and specifically Black home seekers, are familiar with the idea of needing to erase themselves from their home in order to sell their home at the price that they want to, and that's awful. And recently, it's captured a lot of spotlight, and HUD, who handles a lot of fair housing complaints at the federal level, has made an initiative to look into appraisal discrimination more. The value of our homes plays an important role in our ability to accumulate wealth, and of course has an impact on generational wealth. I'm going to show you one example of a family who experienced appraisal discrimination and how they know or what caused them to believe that it was discrimination. Actually, I already have it queued up.
Pathway to building wealth in America. But what's hard in the Bay Area is even harder for some.
And tonight, a look at the growing inequity in home ownership rates in the Bay Area. ABC 7 News race and culture reporter Julian Glover has the story of a Marin couple who almost got cheated out of $500,000.
You know what I mean? It was work, but it was exciting.
Paul and his wife, Tanisha Austin, felt like they captured a slice of the American dream in 2016 when they purchased their first home together, this original Marin City pole home. But it wasn't without challenges.
As soon as like a house came on the market, you go in, you put your bid in, and then you get outbid it by like 100,000 or more rather quickly. And that can be, a little bit depressing.
They bought the home off market from another Black family hoping to make homeownership a reality for a young Black couple. After moving into the home built in the 1960s, the Austins staged major renovations, adding an entire floor and more than 1,000 square feet of space, along with a deck, new floors, a fireplace, and new appliances. Then they got it appraised.
I read the appraisal. I looked at the number and I was like, this is unbelievable.
The family tells me the appraiser was an older white woman and they're convinced race was a factor. The home appraised for $989,000, just $100,000 more than the Austins got it appraised for before they started the work, despite $400,000 in renovations.
It was like, it was a slap in the face.
The Austins immediately called their lender and pushed back. After a month of escalating their complaints, they were approved for a second appraisal. When the date came, they got creative.
We had a conversation with one of our white friends. And she was like, no problem, I'll be Tanisha. I'll bring over some pictures of my family. She made our home look like it belonged to her.
And it worked.
So it appraised for 1.482.
Yeah.
Which was 50% more than what it appraised for by a couple weeks prior.
Almost 1.5, $500,000 more.
The Austins were outraged and believe this is another ugly result of larger systemic issues.
There are implications of the ability to create generational wealth or pass things on if our house is appraised for 50% less than what is valued at.
We know discrimination is in nearly every aspect of the home buying process, and really we need to be addressing it as an industry.
Discrimination in the housing market comes in many forms and has a long history in our country and in the Bay Area, leading to alarmingly low rates of Black Americans owning their own home. Black home ownership lags across the country, with less than half, only 44% of Black Americans owning their own home in 2020. Compare that to 74% for white Americans. Looking at the Golden State, just 34% of Black Californians own a home. In the Bay Area, those numbers are even lower. Just 33% of Black San Francisco residents own a home, compared to 61% of white San Franciscans. The numbers are more drastic in San Jose, with a Black home ownership rate of 31% and a white home ownership rate of 65%, more than double.
Why are we seeing such a great disparity?
There's still problems in the housing industry of Black people being steered away from white neighborhoods, even though that is technically illegal, or Black people not having the same access to mortgages that white people have.
According to the National Association of Realtors, Black applicants are rejected for mortgage loans at rates 3 times higher than that of white applicants. Another factor suppressing Black home ownership.
African Americans have nearly double the amount of student loan debt than we see for white homebuyers. So that's just one of the many hurdles that African American homebuyers are really strapped with and holds back their buying power.
And the pandemic has made things worse. The representative from NAR stressed closing the home ownership gap is...
Okay, I'll pause it at that point. So I think it's important to show you what appraisal discrimination could look like and how significant it can be. Because $500,000 is, within a week time, makes no sense. And I think we should really question and start challenging some of the narratives that we have heard and maybe have, passed around, that homes in certain neighborhoods are valued at that home because of the neighborhood that it's in, and access to opportunities, or whatever excuse is given to why two very similar homes are appraised differently. We should start challenging that narrative, because as soon as a community starts gentrifying, a lot of those arguments no longer apply to a changing community or a changing neighborhood. Same situation when you have, the same home and two very different home seekers in that home. The appraisal value shouldn't change by $500,000 within a week. The other fair housing trend that is important to talk about, that we tend to not talk about too much, is harassment and hate activity. According to FBI crime data, most of the hate crime incidents that occur around residences, around homes. And that's important, because if we know that, then we need to start thinking about, does the Fair Housing Act apply in that situation? Why are there not more complaints around using the Fair Housing Act that tie in these hate incidents that occur? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the FBI defines a hate crime as a traditional criminal offense like murder, arson, vandalism, with an added element of bias. So for the purpose of collecting statistics, the FBI has defined a hate crime as a criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by an offender's bias against X protected class. Knowing how the FBI and the police officer defines hate crime is important when advocating for complainants who may be victims of housing discrimination that don't amount to that level of to the criminal level, right? Because just because someone is experiencing, just because somebody's harassing somebody and they did not injure them or harm their property doesn't mean that that person should be able to walk away and not be held accountable for their actions. The Fair Housing Act, we could use the Fair Housing Act to address the incidents that don't amount to a criminal activity. So for example, we've seen a lot, recently we've seen a lot of flyers in neighborhoods throughout Virginia and probably other parts of the country, and well, definitely other parts of the country, where you know, either the Klan is recruiting or is harassing or trying to or intimidate people who are in the community that are not white. And I remember sitting in a community meeting here in Virginia a few years ago, and a community was very upset because the residents of the community felt threatened. They didn't know if their own neighbors were the ones who were passing out these flyers and dropping them at the doors. And they were having a community meeting. They wanted to know what they could do, what their rights were. And I vividly remember an FBI agent going to the front of the room and telling the residents that they have no rights, that there was nothing unlawful that was done or took place. And that's not necessarily true. If we can find out who was sending out those flyers or who is trying to intimidate or threaten somebody, and a reasonable person feels threatened by whatever flyers, then we can incorporate the Fair Housing Act and see and use that as an avenue for justice and make sure that communities feel safe for anybody who live there. So it's something to be mindful of. Yes, hate crime has a specific, you know, there's language specific to hate crime, but it doesn't mean that harassment should not be, that people who harass people because of a protected class should go unpunished. Here's a recent example. I can show you a recent example of one specific situation on a video, but I wanted to talk a little bit about a case in August 2016. The Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights announced a settlement between settlement of case called Howe v. Kalari, which was a discrimination case filed in the Circuit County Court of Cook County. The case alleged that a neighbor harassed and stalked two African-American teenagers and their mother and repeatedly called them the N-word in suburban Mount Prospect. The terms provide for, so the case settled. The terms provided for a confidential but substantial sum of monetary relief and an in-court apology. So fair housing organizations and those of you who work with clients, whether you're in fair housing or not in housing, if you hear of somebody who is experiencing some sort of harassment, please get them assistance. You can either, again, send them to the Virginia Fair Housing Office, send them to Homeowner Virginia. We want to make sure that people who experience this type of harassment and who are harmed, you know, who are obviously harmed by it can access justice. We had a client recently who was experiencing harassment in their community, and it was a little girl, and she continues to be treated for PTSD because of the harassment she experienced over, you know, years ago. It's not okay. So I have about 10 more minutes and then we'll open up for a question and answer. So I'm almost done. But I wanted to make sure we touch base on the pandemic and what that means in terms of potential fair housing challenges that we've seen. So the real estate industry, like the rest of us, has not experienced stabilization over the past year. It has had to adjust and readjust multiple times throughout this past year. And to be honest, they've done relatively a great job in relation to other housing markets. But because of the adjustment, the true effects of the pandemic on the real estate market and the fair housing implication of those effects are we're still trying to understand, because the market continues to change and their behaviors continue to change. But I can touch a little bit about what we've seen to be a little bit consistent. So first is virtual tours. Real estate market, hands down, adapted really quickly. And it has, again, done a significantly better job than, you know, their counterpart, the rental market, in making sure that there are safe virtual ways to experience, you know, to shop for a home. It's pretty common practice for real estate agents to offer client virtual tours. And the industry has provided an array of options to agents and clients. I won't name all of them, but there is a lot of options out there for agents to provide virtual tours for their clients. Availability and quality of live tours, of course, is dependent on cell coverage, Wi-Fi, but agents are eager to make that sale and eager to please their customers and come up with alternatives when they need to. So that their ability to adapt has been great, but we need to make sure that alternative safe tour options are provided to people with limited technology, and also are people who require to physically experience the space due to a disability. For example, if if somebody is requiring a specific technology because they are, because of their visual or hearing disability, we need to make sure that the real estate industry is providing for that. In-person showings, agents, well, a few months ago, agents were not offering to drive home buyers to see a list of homes. That shifted this summer, but I expect that as the pandemic and the numbers continue to increase, that social distancing will come back into play, as well as the open houses being a little bit more far in between. But generally, seller-occupied homes, or home sellers really wanted to make sure that people who were coming into their homes were limited because of their concern about, catching the coronavirus. And so because of that, they really wanted to make sure that they were interested buyers. And so they would ask that they see the home virtually multiple times, or are proven some sort of way that they are serious buyers. And so while that's important, that's definitely important. Please take care of your health. We need to make sure that real estate agents are making sure that they are not using those excuses as a way to provide differential treatment based off a protected class. And that, what the seller is, or the seller is saying is true. We've also noticed that in a way to, because people were concerned about minimizing the amount of people in a home, one thing that they were doing was saying that children were not allowed in open houses or to tour a home. So you can have a single mom and her kid, and that kid would not be allowed to inside the home. And so the single mom is going to have to get a babysitter or find somebody to take care of the kid every time she needs to look at home. That's not practical. It's not okay. It's not okay that single mom could take a friend, as if that friend has less exposure to COVID. So we need to be mindful of potential familial status discrimination happening in that area. And if there is a policy, if you know a policy that, if you are a real estate agency, I encourage you to adjust that policy and make sure that that you're not engaging in a Fair Housing Act violation. And if you hear of that as a consumer, please let me know. Self-guided tours. This part is really interesting. So for the most part, self-guided tours, it's when you, a real estate, if you're interested in purchasing a home or touring a home, a real estate company might send you a passcode or some sort of link to be able to access a home, which is cool. I like tech, that's great. But what we've come across is that some real estate agencies have been, and I wouldn't say a lot of them, it's very few and far between, have been requiring that home buyers upload a photo ID and a selfie before even allowing them to have access to a home. And usually that's after some sort of virtual conversation. And usually the technology also includes a camera at the home. So it's kind of odd that you're also asking for a photo ID, usually a driver's license, and a selfie. Why that's problematic? Because if you read the fine print, which consumers typically do not do, but if you read the fine print, they will say that you are agreeing to the collection and storage of biometric identifiers by third-party companies. And since there's already concern about transparency of our data and how that data is being used in ways to create, to engage in further discriminatory practices, we just need to be mindful of how that can snowball. And for those who don't know, biometric our measurements are things like fingerprints, facial patterns, and the sound of your voice. Other potential discriminatory practices, health screenings. So real estate offices, some of them are requiring appointments, which makes sense because they want to make sure that they minimize the amount of people or traffic within their office or within a model home, especially these new construction communities. But prior to an appointment, they're gonna, call and inquire about, take you through a screening, like asking about your health symptoms, asking questions about your fever. But some of those questions were overly intrusive. And some questions were specific to specific countries, where people visiting specific countries, not necessarily related to actual COVID data. So we just want to be mindful of when you see overly intrusive health screening protocols, that might be a concern and maybe a way of keeping certain people out of service. And then finally, the market is unpredictable. The employment market is unpredictable. The housing market's a little bit unpredictable. And so buyers and agents are responding to a tighter market by wanting to make sure that, again, their consumers are serious, quote unquote, serious buyers. And so some agents are responding by, again, going back to what they did at the beginning at the end of the housing crisis, which is asking for proof that you can afford a home, and that proof comes in a pre-qualification letter or a pre-approval letter. If you're asking that of all of your clients, that's fine. But what we tend to see is that is only asked of individuals that are they perceived to probably not be able to afford a home or to do business with them. And that typically tends to line up with a certain demographic. So just be really mindful that you're allowed to ask for those things, but you need to make sure that you're doing that to everybody and asking that of everybody. And then last topic, we all know the Richmond market is just like the national market is a hot housing market. And when the market is this hot, obviously agents are overwhelmed, they're hard to reach. Sometimes it can prolong closing. Homes are are being sold above asking. I've heard almost $100,000 above asking. It's pretty wild. What that means is that usually when a market, whether it's rental or sales or even lending, when the market tightens and there's less housing stock, that's again an opportunity for sellers or real estate agents to be picky and choosy about who they do business with. And we need to be mindful about who they are make sure that they are not doing that specific to a person's protected class status. So when a market tightens, we tend to see that there's also a heightened discrimination. All right, so we ended a few minutes early, but I wanted to, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and I'm gonna see if you guys have any questions in the chat. And if you do have questions, feel free to add them and we'll get to them. Mike Burnett, if you see any questions, or if Kelly, if you see any questions, feel free to pop them my way. Okay, Pamela Johnson says, different race, nationality, socioeconomic standing, et cetera. How do you change? Reject the thought that you are where you are because it's where you should be, that you need to maintain the status. I'm not really sure I understand the question. Okay. Well, while we're waiting for more questions, oh, okay, thanks, Pamela. I wasn't sure. Thank you. While we're waiting for more questions, I just want to give a little plug. If you do feel like you're experiencing housing discrimination, you can file a complaint directly again with the Virginia Fair Housing Office, and I included the phone number along with the website here. You can also file a complaint with HUD's Fair Housing Office, and again, I included their phone number because their link is it's a little long to include. You can also call us at home. I left my email address and our phone number at the office, and we can definitely talk you through whatever you're experiencing and help you navigate the complaint process. Or if we need to, we can look into the matter for you. All right, Monica, I see that you just popped open. So I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Shivaughn. What an incredible day. This has been such an awesome discussion. There should be no question that access to housing still remains unequal after we heard everyone speak today. Despite longstanding laws guarding against discrimination, Black, Indigenous people of color, also known as BIPOC, and other disadvantaged groups, continue to have a hard time finding a quality place to live in a high opportunity neighborhood or have access to credit. Communities of color are at a high risk of housing instability and the loss of financial security, homeownership, and wealth. Whether it's from racial disparities or source of income, I think we would all agree that our priorities are clear, that eliminating housing discrimination and increasing housing opportunities and homeownership opportunities is paramount. I want to thank you so much for attending our Fair Housing Focus event today. Our goal was to increase public awareness, encourage conversations, and really provide you all with some tools and resources on how we can dismantle and combat housing discrimination. I hope that you learned something new today from our fabulous speakers. And I also want to say a special thank you to our regional partners. Hopefully you were inspired to join us in this fight for fair housing. Shivaughn provided you all some information on how to reach out to us, but I want to encourage you to visit our website at homeofva.org for more information on how you can get involved in this movement.